Chapter 458. Go to the net. Lakshmi has come to the world? Meduo and Changbajila shouted in surprise at the same time. Go to the net. 7 K.O.M. Dorji Tenzin smiled and said, yes, this is great news. Meduo asked in confusion, but, Dorji Tenzin, aren't you the guardian Vajra of the Kathoda temple? Why are you helping the living Buddha find the Lakshmi? Dorji Tenzin smiled slightly and didn't say anything. A monk beside him said with a smile, now Dorji Tenzin has been transferred to the Vajra sacred mountain and has become one of the 18 mountain-protecting monks. Meduo and Changbajila were overjoyed at the same time and said, this is great news. The Kathoda temple has a mountain-protecting monk of the sacred mountain. This is a great thing. Dorji Tenzin's face was neither sad nor happy. He saluted and said with a smile, this is the favor of the living Buddha. I just happened to be there. Meduo smiled and said, why don't you tell me how it happened? Dorji Tenzin sighed slightly and said, speaking of which, I have to thank Li Yundong. At that time, he returned the Mahamudra Secret Method Sutra of the Kathoda temple. When I returned to the Kathoda temple with the sutra, the abbot was overjoyed and recommended me to meet the living Buddha. When the living Buddha saw me, he said that I had the root of wisdom and opportunity, so he kept me by his side and made me a mountain guardian monk. Meduo smiled and said, that's too much of a coincidence. Dorji Tenzin, do you know who this is? As she spoke, she pointed to Zhou Qin beside her. Dorji Tenzin had been paying attention to Zhou Qin. In his eyes, Zhou Qin's aura was incredibly strong and exuberant, and she was dressed like a Han person. Dorji Tenzin had only seen such a powerful Han person from Li Yundong. Dorji Tenzin put his palms together and asked, I don't know. Meduo, please introduce her to me. Meduo said with a smile, this is Li Yundong's disciple. Her name is Zhou Qin. Dorji Tenzin's eyes lit up, and he couldn't help but laugh. Ah, it turns out to be Grand Master Li's disciple. Sure enough, a famous teacher produces a brilliant disciple. The master is a handsome figure in the Central Plains, and the disciple is also so outstanding. I admire you. Zhou Qin had also heard Li Yundong mention Dorji Tenzin. She also smiled and returned the greeting with the Taoist etiquette. She smiled and said, Master Dorji Tenzin, you flatter me. Although my master's cultivation is amazing, I believe he doesn't deserve the title of Grand Master. Dorji Tenzin smiled and said, although I am not a Grand Master now, I will definitely be one in the future. Moreover, I don't dare to accept your title of Master. Zhou Qin also pursed her lips and smiled. Even if you're not a master now, you'll definitely be one in the future. After saying that, they all laughed out loud. When Meduo saw that Zhou Qin and Dorji Tenzin were talking happily, she smiled and said, I remember that there was a poem in the book of the Han people that said, it's a small world. I think it's a bit like that now. Sister Han, don't leave tonight. Drink and sing with us. Tibetans were warm and hospitable. When they met a guest they liked, they would warmly urge them to stay and sing and dance with them in the evening. Zhou Qin shook her head with a smile and declined Meduo's kindness. She said, I'm going to carry Holy Mountain to cultivate. I'll drink your Highland barley wine when I have the chance in the future. Meduo was disappointed. Ah. Can't you stay tonight? Sister Han, it's almost night. Do you know how cold it is here at night? Don't leave tonight. Stay in my tent for the night. I have a lot to say to you. As she spoke, Meduo couldn't help but take Zhou Qin's hand and shake it gently, begging in a low voice. Although Zhou Qin's character was firm and strong, when she saw Meduo pleading so pitifully, she really couldn't bear to refuse her. Her heart softened and she was about to sigh secretly when she suddenly heard the sound of the bell of the scripture tube not far away. A magnetic voice said, Dorji Tenzin, call Meduo to me. Dorji Tenzin looked back and saw a yellow-crowned lama sitting on a double-humped camel nodding at him. Dorji Tenzin smiled at Meduo and said, Meduo, Master Erdini wants to see you. Meiduo was slightly surprised. Ah, is that Master Erdini of Potala Palace? Dorji Tenzin smiled and said, yes. Meiduo was immediately surprised. She tidied up her clothes in a panic and said, why does the master want to see me? Changbajila looked at Meiduo enviously and said, Meiduo, you are so lucky to be summoned by Master Erdini. I've only seen him from afar when I was on a pilgrimage in my life. Meiduo became more and more nervous. She tidied herself up several times and still asked Zhou Qin worriedly, Sister Han, do you think I'm okay? Although Zhou Qin didn't know the status of Master Erdini in the hearts of the Tibetans, she knew that he must be an extraordinary person. She smiled and comforted her, Meiduo, piety is not in your clothes, but in your heart. In the distance, Master Erdini also clearly heard Zhou Qin's words. He looked at Zhou Qin with appreciation and said with a smile, you're right. Meiduo, come here. I'm not a vulture. I don't eat people. The monks who followed him all laughed, and Meiduo's heart was also shaken. She boldly walked up to Erdini and blinked her eyes curiously at the master of Potala Palace. Master Erdini looked at Meiduo carefully, nodded to himself, and smiled kindly. Meiduo, when were you born? Meiduo was a little confused, but she still gave him her name. Master Erdini pinched his fingers and calculated silently in his heart. Then he smiled at Meiduo and said, Meiduo, come closer. Meiduo took 2 steps forward curiously, only to see Master Erdini hand her the prayer wheel in his hand. He smiled kindly and said, Meiduo, take this and see if you can spin it. Meiduo smiled and said, what's so difficult about it? Isn't this something that everyone can do? Dorji Tenzin couldn't help but interject with a smile, Meiduo, you don't know. Do you know what you're holding in your hand? Meiduo blinked and said, isn't it just a hand mani wheel? What's so strange about that? The Tibetans called the hand-cranked prayer wheel the mani wheel. Almost every devout believer of Tibetan Buddhism had one. The Tibetans firmly believed that turning the prayer wheel would give them merit. Turning it once was equivalent to reciting the Tripitaka once. Turning it twice was equivalent to reciting all the Buddhist scriptures. Turning it 3 times could eliminate the hindrances of one's body, mouth, mind, and sins. Turning it 10 times could eliminate the hindrances of sins like Mount Sumeru. Turning it 100 times could make one's merit equal to that of King Yama. Turning it 1,000 times could allow all living beings to attain Dharmakaya. Turning it 10,000 times could allow all living beings to be liberated. Turning it 100,000 times could allow the Bodhisattva Guanyin to meet the saints. Turning it 1,000,000 times could allow all living beings in the 6 paths of samsara to be at peace and happiness. Turning it 1,000,000 times could allow all living beings in the 6 paths of samsara to be free from the sea of suffering. Although Meiduo's words were naive, they were not without reason. The monks and lamas around all laughed. Dorji Tenzin said with a smile, Meiduo, you have Erdini's personal mani wheel in your hand. Only people with great merit and dharma power can spin it. Ordinary people can't spin it no matter how hard they spin it. Meiduo was shocked. She quickly looked at the prayer wheel in her hand and saw that it was made of pure gold. The cylinder was engraved with the 6-word mantra of Tibetan Buddhism, and the middle of the cylinder was also engraved with mantras. Around the mantras were also engraved with exquisite patterns of birds and beasts. These birds and beasts were painted with colorful paint and inlaid with corals and gems. At a glance, one could tell that they were not ordinary objects. Meiduo felt that the prayer wheel in her hand was heavy. She couldn't help but raise her head and say to Erdini eagerly, Master Erdini, I'm afraid I can't do it. Please, please don't turn it, lest I make a fool of myself. Erdini laughed and waved his hand. It's okay. Go ahead. Seeing Erdini smiling kindly at her, Meiduo's courage slowly grew. She thought to herself, I'll turn it. She gently shook the prayer wheel, and the golden bells on the prayer wheel began to move slowly. After a while, the prayer wheel began to turn and emitted a clear sound. Meiduo giggled and said, Haha, I'm turning it, I'm turning it. I'm also a person with great merit and power. Dorji Tenzin and the other monks were all shocked. They stared at Meiduo with their mouths agape, unable to say a word. They thought in shock, it's impossible. When I turned Master Erdini's Mani wheel, I used all my strength, but this prayer wheel didn't turn. Dorji Tenzin looked at Erdini and stammered, Master, what's going on? Erdini's face turned solemn. He jumped down from the back of the camel and knelt down in the snow with great devotion. He kowtowed to Meiduo and shouted loudly, I've finally found you, Banda Lamb. Zhou Qin, who was not far away, was stunned by his kowtow and shout. However, in the eyes of the other Tibetans, it was no less than the explosion of an atomic bomb. All the Tibetans were stunned. They stared at Meiduo, who was also stunned. Some of them stammered, No, it can't be. Meiduo is Banda Lamb? Changbajila's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. He couldn't help but say, That's impossible, right? Master Erdini must have made a mistake, right? How could Meiduo be Banda Lamb? As soon as he shouted, the other Tibetans who were on good terms with Meiduo were all shocked. Yes, how could Meiduo be Banda Lamb? Dorji Tenzin also whispered to Erdini in shock, Master, could it be that you've made a mistake? However, Erdini turned a deaf ear to him. After 3 kowtows and 9 kowtows, he stood up and patted the snow off his body. He respectfully extended his hand to Meiduo and said, Banda Lamb, please give me the Mani wheel. At this time, Meiduo seemed to have lost her ability to think. She handed the prayer wheel in her hand to Erdini in a daze. After Erdini respectfully took it with both hands, he turned to look at Dorji Tenzin and said, Why don't you turn it around? Dorji Tenzin immediately took a step back and said, Master, I don't have great merit and power. Of course, I can't turn it. Erdini nodded and walked over to Changbajila. Why don't you turn it around? Changbajila swallowed hard. He looked at Meiduo, gritted his teeth, and picked up the prayer wheel. However, no matter how hard he tried, the prayer wheel was like a piece of pig iron. He couldn't turn it no matter how hard he tried. After shaking it for a long time, Changbajila handed the prayer wheel back to Erdini dejectedly and said, Master, I can't turn it. Erdini turned to the other Tibetans and said, Who wants to try it? The Tibetans looked at each other in dismay. 2 young people jumped out and tried it, but they also retreated with dejection. At this time, the Tibetans finally believed that the prayer wheel in Erdini's hand could only be turned by people with great merit and power. Facts spoke louder than words. At this time, the situation in front of them had no choice but to believe it. The Tibetans looked at Meiduo with complicated eyes and all bowed down one after another, shouting loudly, Banda Lamb. Seeing them talking in Tibetan, Zhou Qin couldn't help but pull at Changbajila, who was in a daze, and ask in a low voice, Uncle Changbajila, what's going on? Why are you calling Meiduo Banda Lamb? Changbajila said with a strange expression, Sister Han, do you know what Banda Lamb means? Zhou Qin shook her head and said, I don't know, that's why I'm asking you. Changbajila smiled bitterly and said, Banda Lamb means Lakshmi Goddess. Zhou Qin was shocked and said with a stunned expression, Do you mean Meiduo is the Lakshmi Goddess? 8, maybe. Chapter 459. Go to Watch Network. Before Zhou Qin had met Li Yundong, her understanding of Tibetan Buddhism was limited to movies and TV programs. But after she became his disciple, she began to read a lot of classics of ancient and modern Buddhism and Taoism. In particular, Li Yundong's best kung fu was the mantra Mahamudra, so Zhou Qin had also read some materials about Tibetan Buddhism. Although she didn't know that the Tibetan word Banda Lamb meant auspicious goddess, she knew that auspicious goddess was an extremely important protector of Tibetan Buddhism, also known as the goddess of merit. Zhou Qin looked at Meiduo, who was not far away, dumbfounded. She had never expected that this Tibetan girl, who had been talking to her intimately before, would turn out to be the reincarnated auspicious goddess. Zhou Qin was stunned for a while, and she couldn't help but feel puzzled. She turned to Changbajila and asked, That's not right. You Tibetans are looking for reincarnated spiritual children. Aren't you looking for newborn ones? Meiduo is already 18 years old, isn't she? She doesn't look like a reincarnated spiritual child. Chambajila smiled bitterly and said, only the reincarnations of other gods or living Buddhas will find newborn spiritual children, and living Buddhas can calculate where they will be reincarnated. But Banda Lam is a very special god. She has 2 faces and 2 forms. One is the quiet and beautiful Banda Lam, which symbolizes purity and kindness. The other is the ferocious Tsing Lam, which symbolizes anger and majesty. When Tsing Lam shows her true body, no matter who sees her, they will die with her. I heard that in order to find Banda Lam, a few spiritual children had accidentally glanced at Tsing Lam and died with her. Zhou Qin asked in confusion, so? Chambajila said, so, finding Banda Lam is the most difficult, especially when she doesn't show her true body. No one can tell where she is. Alas, I didn't expect Meiduo to be Banda Lam. Zhou Qin saw Chambajila's worried face and kept sighing. She couldn't help asking, isn't it a good thing that Meiduo is the reincarnation of a god? Why are you so sad? Chambajila glanced at Zhou Qin and sighed hesitantly. Alas, I can't explain it to you. Let's not talk about it. You'll know later. I have to pay my respects to Banda Lam quickly. If I make her angry, it won't be good. After that, Chambajila followed his clansmen and kowtowed. He respectfully prostrated himself in the snow and bowed to Meiduo. At this time, Meiduo was completely dumbfounded. She looked at the crowd around her, who were worshipping her, and was speechless. After a long time, she stammered, Master Erdini, you must have made a mistake. How could I be Banda Lam? Are you joking? Erdini put his palms together and said solemnly, how dare I lie in front of a true god? How can such a thing be joked about? The Mani wheel you just turned is called the Great Merit Mani wheel. Even if I wanted to turn it, I would have to use all my spiritual energy to barely do it. Banda Lam, you can easily turn this Mani wheel. Doesn't this mean that you are the reincarnation of a true god? Meiduo was stunned. She stared blankly at her hands, which were as white as jade, and then looked back at the people who were kneeling on the ground. Even Dorji Tenzin, who had been joking with her just now, was kneeling on the ground respectfully, not daring to look up at her. Meiduo bent down to pull Dorji Tenzin, but he seemed to have eyes on his head. He immediately crouched down a little more and avoided her hand. Meiduo's hand froze in midair. She turned around unwillingly to pull her clansmen and said, everyone, get up. I'm not Banda Lam. I'm Meiduo. Don't do this. When the clansmen were pulled by Meiduo, they only waved their hands in panic and kept shaking their heads, not daring to look at Meiduo. Meiduo felt as if someone had pinched her heart. She walked over to Chambajila and said in a choked voice, Chambajila, are you going to ignore me too? Chambajila lay on the ground motionlessly. He sighed softly and said, Banda Lam, what do you mean by that? Tears trickled down Meiduo's cheeks, and she said with a sad expression, Chambajila, I'm Meiduo, not Banda Lam. Why do you believe me? Chambajila was silent for a long time before he raised his head slightly to look at Meiduo and sighed heavily. Meiduo, the master said that you are Banda Lam. Then you are Banda Lam. Whether I believe it or not. It doesn't matter. After that, he crawled deeper into the snow. No matter how much Meiduo sobbed, he never raised his head again. For a moment, everyone on the snow-wind plateau fell into silence. There was no sound on the vast and empty plateau. Only Meiduo's cries echoed in the cold wind, making people sad and moved. Meiduo looked at Zhou Qin. At this time, all the people around her were kneeling on the ground. Only this Han sister was still standing in the snow, looking at her with a complicated look in her eyes. Meiduo didn't know why, but when she saw Zhou Qin's gaze, her heart ached. She couldn't help it anymore. She threw herself into Zhou Qin's arms and burst into tears. Han sister, I'm Meiduo, not Bonda Lam. Although Zhou Qin didn't understand why Meiduo was so sad, she couldn't help but feel a little sad when she heard Meiduo's sad cry. She gently patted Meiduo's back and said softly, I know. You are Meiduo, not Bonda Lam. No matter what kind of god you are, in my eyes, you are Meiduo, aren't you? When Meiduo heard this, she cried even harder. She sobbed, and her tears fell like pearls from a broken necklace. She hugged Zhou Qin tightly and sobbed, but they don't believe that I'm Meiduo. Zhou Qin comforted her in a soft voice, Meiduo, what's wrong with being the reincarnation of a god? Isn't this a good thing? Meiduo shook her head vigorously and cried, if I were Bonda Lam, I would never be able to leave Potala Palace. I wouldn't be able to go to Tiannan City, I wouldn't be able to get into my Han brother's university, and I wouldn't be able to see him again. Zhou Qin let out a cry. It was as if the softest part of her heart had been hit by Meiduo's words. If it were me, I wouldn't be able to see Li Yundong and the person I love. What would I do then? For a moment, the resolute and strong girl seemed to empathize with Meiduo and shed tears silently. Suddenly, as if she had been possessed, she made up her mind. Zhou Qin gently patted Meiduo on the shoulder and said softly, Meiduo, do you want to be Bonda Lam? If you don't, I'll take you away even if it costs me my life. Meiduo, who was crying, was stunned and forgot to cry. Not far away, Erdini heard Zhou Qin's words and raised his head. He glared at Zhou Qin fiercely and shouted, how dare you say such a thing? Erdini's shout immediately shook the mountains, and his voice echoed in the sky. The power was really enough to make the mountains collapse, and the wind and clouds change color. The monks and lamas crawling in the snow also jumped up one by one and looked at Zhou Qin covetously, their eyes full of murderous light. Even Meiduo's clansmen raised their heads and looked at Zhou Qin with unkind eyes. They were all eager to have a try. Changbajila raised his head in horror and shouted at Meiduo, Meiduo, are you crazy? Do you want to kill the little Han girl? Only then did Meiduo tremble all over. She hugged Zhou Qin and said in a sad voice, Sister Han, don't do anything stupid. I'm just sad in my heart and want to find someone to cry with. When I'm done crying, I'll be fine. After that, Meiduo couldn't help but burst into tears again. The tears fell down her round face and fell into the snow. Zhou Qin quickly glanced at the surrounding monks and quickly fixed her eyes on Meiduo. Her expression did not change as she said lightly, Meiduo, I just want to ask you one thing. Do you want to be Bonda Lam? Meiduo stared blankly at Zhou Qin. She stared blankly at this Han sister whom she had only met once. She stared blankly at this stranger who was willing to risk her life to protect her. Everyone held their breath and looked at Meiduo, not daring to breathe too much. They were all quietly waiting for her choice. After staring at Zhou Qin for a while, Meiduo suddenly smiled sadly and quickly wiped her tears with her hand. She forced a smile and said, Sister Han, thank you. I won't go to Tiannan City. Can you help me tell Brother Han that I can't go to his school? At this point, Meiduo couldn't help but sob. Sister Han, when you go back, remember to tell him that there is a girl named Meiduo in Potala Palace thinking of him. When you have time in the future, you can come and see her. She was originally a poor woman who loved Li Yundong deeply but couldn't get his love. At this time, she had met Meiduo, who was even more pitiful than her. Even though she was usually strong-willed and had tempered her will into steel on the way to the Zhuji phase, at this time, she couldn't help but feel that the steel she had tempered had softened, and she began to shed tears of sympathy for Meiduo, who was in the same boat as her. Seeing that Zhou Qin was also crying, Meiduo thought that she was sympathizing with her. She forced a smile and comforted Zhou Qin, saying, Don't be sad for me. I'm fine. Meiduo is very strong. In fact, it's good to be Bonda Lam. Many Tibetan girls want to be Bonda Lam, but they can't. At this time, seeing that Meiduo had decided to be Bonda Lam, Erdini also withdrew his fierce gaze and became kind again. He lowered his eyes, gently shook the prayer wheel, and recited the scriptures. The monks on the side were still surrounding Meiduo, as if they were urging her to go on her way. Meiduo glanced at them, then turned around and ran to her yak. She took out a woolen cotton-padded jacket, then ran to Zhou Qin and stuffed it into her hand. Meiduo smiled and shed tears. She said, "Sister Han, I'm leaving. You have to be careful on the way. It's very cold on the top of Kari Holy Mountain. Don't get sick from the cold." Zhou Qin pinched the soft woolen cotton-padded jacket and couldn't say no. She just sighed slightly and said, "Is there anything else you want me to tell Master Li Yundong?" Meiduo smiled and shook her head. "No, I've thought it through. If we are fated to meet again in the future, I will see him again. Let's talk about it then." Zhou Qin watched Meiduo turn around and leave in a daze. Her delicate figure looked particularly sad in the wind and snow all over the sky. After Zhou Qin watched Meiduo get on Dorji Tenzin's yak, Meiduo began to sing the song that she hadn't finished before. 6th, it's best not to face each other, so that we won't meet again. 7th, it's best not to make mistakes, so that we won't be disappointed. 8th, it's best not to marry, so that we won't be together. 9th, it's best not to rely on each other, so that we won't be together. 10th, it's best not to meet, so that we won't be together. But if we've met before, we'll know each other. Why not see each other again? It's safe to say goodbye to you, so that we won't miss each other in life and death." Zi Yuan and Wan Hongling, who had witnessed all this from a distance, watched in a daze as Meiduo gradually walked away with Erdini, Dorji Tenzin, and the others. Then, Changbajila led his clansmen in the opposite direction. On the snowy plateau, Zhou Qin was the only one left standing silently in the snowfield, like an ice sculpture. For a moment, the wind and snow in the vast world swept away all the footprints on the snow, and the snow fell even heavier. Chapter 460. Go to Watch Network. Looking at Zhou Qin's departing figure, Wan Hongling sighed softly and said, "I didn't expect Zhou Qin, who is usually cold and aloof, to have such a warm heart. However, she almost caused a great disaster." Go to Kanban. If Meiduo really says that she doesn't want to be Banda Lam, I'm afraid we won't be able to sit back and watch. In that case, there will be another fierce battle between the esoteric sect and the Taoists. Zi Yuan sighed softly and said, "Although Meiduo doesn't know about the cultivation world, she knows that if she doesn't agree, I'm afraid Zhou Qin will die here." So, she agreed. However, what impressed me was that Zhou Qin was still able to remain calm and composed in the face of several mountain-guarding divine monks. Not to mention anything else, just her ability to maintain her qi and her bearing have already surpassed many cultivators who have been cultivating for a long time. No matter what realm Li Yundong's cultivation will reach in the future, he can rest assured that his cultivation and kung fu will definitely be inherited by Zhou Qin in the future. In the future, she will definitely be an earth-shattering female cultivator. A sect has produced two unprecedented geniuses like Li Yundong and Zhou Qin at the same time. It's impossible for this sect not to be glorious. For some reason, Wan Hongling suddenly thought of her Linggong sect. She felt the decline of Linggong's sect at this time and couldn't help feeling sour in her heart. What's the use of just having a powerful disciple? If all the disciples he takes in the future are powerful, then that's true ability. Zi Yuan smiled slightly and said, "I don't know where Li Yundong's next disciple will be." While Zhou Qin was in the Zhuji phase of Kari Holy Mountain, in the distant State University of Pennsylvania, Chris, who had been to Tiannan City as an exchange student before she died, was wandering in the warm sunshine of the campus, preparing her graduation thesis. In December, Pennsylvania was suffering from a cold snap. The students in the university usually wore thick clothes and wrapped their faces tightly with scarves to prevent the cold wind from getting into their clothes. But today was a rare sunny day. The sun shone warmly on the evergreen lawn of the campus. Many beautiful female students took off their thick down jackets and revealed their beautiful and graceful figures to their heart's content. Chris was wearing a yellow hand-knitted round-neck sweater and a plaid woolen dress. She was wearing a pair of warm, flesh-colored pants. She looked exquisite, tall, and sexy. Her golden hair cascaded over her shoulders like waves, and her delicate, doll-like face attracted admiring gazes from the opposite sex wherever she went. Chris carried a few books and found a rather clean patch of grass. She then enjoyed the warm winter sun while flipping through the books in her hands. But not long after, she suddenly heard someone shouting at her from not far away, "Chris, hey, Chris." Chris raised her head and looked in the direction of the voice. At this time, the sun was slightly dazzling. Chris couldn't help turning her face sideways. Her golden hair fell beside her cheek, making her originally round and beautiful face even more feminine and hazy. She put a canopy in front of her forehead with her hand and narrowed her eyes slightly. She saw that it was John, whom she hadn't seen for 2 or 3 months. She immediately smiled and said, "It's you, John. I haven't seen you for a long time. How have you been recently?" Although John and Chris were good friends who often communicated with each other, he was still shocked by the beauty that Chris showed at this time. He slowed down his pace as if he was afraid to disturb the beauty that was like an oil painting. John couldn't help but sigh, "Chris, since you came back from China, you have become more and more beautiful." Chris smiled slightly and stroked her curly hair behind her ear. "Really? But I don't think there's any change." Hardedef shook his head. "No, you have an additional sense of mystery and tranquil beauty about you. It's really breathtaking." Chris closed the book with a smile and said, "John, did you come here specially to compliment me today? If so, thank you. If not, please get down to business, because..." Chris shook the book in her hand. "I still have to prepare my graduation thesis." John took a closer look and saw that Chris was holding a Chinese book with Chinese characters written on it. He grinned and said, "Ha, I know these words." With that, John casually sat next to Chris and carefully identified a few words on the book. But after staring at it for a long time, he felt that these words were very familiar to him, but he couldn't say them out loud. He was so anxious that he scratched his ears and cheeks. Chris pursed her lips into a smile and taunted him in Chinese, "I told you that your Chinese is still far from good, but you still don't believe me." John stared at her and retorted in some awkward Chinese, "Nonsense. I'm now the student who has made the fastest progress in the Chinese class of the Confucius Institute. Even the teacher praised me for my fast progress." Chris giggled and said, "All right then, Mr. Most Improved. How come you can't even recognize such simple words?" John was so angry that he blurted out a mouthful of English and said, "Who made these words look so strange? Damn it, what the hell are these words?" Seeing that John was so anxious that the veins on his forehead were bulging, Chris couldn't help laughing. "I'm teasing you. These words are from the inner canon of the Yellow Emperor. This is an ancient seal script in Chinese. Even many Chinese may not be able to recognize it. This is my grandmother's book. When she gave it to me, I didn't even recognize these words." John breathed a sigh of relief and patted his chest in shock. "That's good. That means it's not a problem with my Chinese." "Chris, you scared me just now. I thought my Chinese was still as bad as dog shit. If it's really the same as before, then my master will not want me anymore." Chris looked at John with a smile, but her beautiful eyes suddenly showed a trace of confusion. "John, do you really want to learn Kung Fu so much?" John nodded vigorously without hesitation and said, "Of course." "Chris, when you first came back a few months ago, didn't you also want to learn Kung Fu from a master every day? Why are you asking such a question now?" Chris looked embarrassed. "I've thought about it, and my grandmother also supports me, but my father won't let me go. My mother also wants me to finish my studies first. I think about it myself, and I also feel that this matter is a little too illusory." John said with an exaggerated expression, "My God, Chris, are you still doubting my master's ability? Have you ever seen anyone in this world who can dodge a bullet within a distance of 5 meters? Have you ever seen anyone who can jump down from the fourth floor with a person in his arms and act as if nothing happened? Have you ever seen anyone who can punch a big man like me, who weighs nearly 200 pounds, 90 kilograms, into the air? John suddenly said with a serious face, I know that your parents want you to inherit the family business in the future, so they want to keep you by their side. However, I will definitely go to China again, and I've already applied for the visa in the past few days. The reason I came to you this time is to ask if you want to go with me. Chris lowered her head with a complicated expression. She couldn't help but recall the memories of when she had gone to Tiannan University as an exchange student. In Chris's opinion, Tiannan University was far inferior to the University of Pennsylvania in all aspects. The quality of the students and the teachers was also uneven. Even the teachers and officials of this place had left a bad impression on her. But what impressed Chris the most was the incredible Chinese boy. Every time Chris closed her eyes, she seemed to be able to see Li Yundong's supernatural performance as he dodged bullets. It was really a shocking memory that she would never forget for the rest of her life. Especially when her grandmother told her that Li Yundong might be a legendary cultivator and that he might know the art of immortality, Chris was even more tempted. She even wanted to immediately ask Li Yundong to teach her the art of immortality. But as time went by, this impulse slowly dissipated and calmed down. In the end, Chris chose to study instead of the illusory cultivation. However, just when Chris thought that she was about to forget about this matter, John appeared again. He was still worshipping that mysterious and powerful Eastern boy, and still had a heart of stone, wanting to go to the faraway East to learn from him. Chris' memory, which had already faded away, was evoked again. Her heart suddenly pounded. She lowered her head and remained silent. She just quietly stroked the exquisite cover of the book in her hand. Seeing the excitement in Chris' eyes, Hardadef said, Chris, what are you hesitating about? Do you know how old you are? Please, you are only 20 years old. You look like an 80-year-old grandmother who is looking forward to the future. Do you know what 20 years old is? This is the age to travel around. While we are still young, we still have the courage to travel around. If you don't go out now, when will you? Are you going to regret it when you are old and can't walk anymore? Chris' heart suddenly skipped a beat. She remembered what her grandmother, Lin Guiying, had once said to her, Chris, if you meet the real person, don't hesitate. You must find a way to worship him as your master. Otherwise, you will definitely be like me in the future, watching your youth fade away. It will be too late for regrets at this time. This sentence made the wild and adventurous spirit in Chris' blood, inherited from her sailor grandfather, burn. She slowly raised her head, and her eyes were full of sparkling light. Hardadef saw Chris' eyes and shouted in surprise, Chris, have you decided to go to China with me? Chris smiled and sighed. Hardadef, you can be a politician in the future. You are very eloquent. Chris grinned. I'm not Arnold Schwarzenegger. Chris pursed her lips and smiled. That's right. Arnold isn't as good at fighting as you. Hardadef cooperated and made a bodybuilder's move, then made a few fighting moves. He was so excited that his eyebrows almost flew up. Chris, when are we leaving? I can't wait to fly to China and start a new life. Chris shook her head and said with a smile, you are really optimistic. You have to learn Chinese better. You know, that bastard doesn't seem to be very willing to accept us as disciples. Hardadef waved his hand carelessly. He said word by word in Chinese, Chris, as the saying goes, sincerity can move metal and stone. I don't believe that my sincerity can't move master. I will definitely make him accept me as a disciple. Chris smiled and said in Chinese, thank God, these few sentences are quite standard. It seems that you have practiced for a long time. Hardadef laughed and switched back to English. I practice dozens of times a day. Damn it, Chinese is too difficult to learn. But I'm going to China soon to continue learning, ha ha ha. As he said this, Hardadef happily somersaulted on the spot. He was as excited as a child and shouted with joy, haha, we are going to China. Chris, let's go to the east together. Chris smiled and was about to speak when she suddenly heard a voice next to her. Go to the east? What east? Are you going to elope? If you are going to elope, take me with you. Chapter 461. Go to watch net. When Chris and John heard this, they turned their heads at the same time. They saw a tall, voluptuous girl with brown hair and blue eyes standing in front of them, smiling at them. Watch net. 7 km. This woman was about 1.75 meters tall. Her two long legs were amazingly proportioned. She had the body of a famous model. Her waist was so slender that it seemed as if it would break with a single step. However, her chest was astonishingly magnificent. A deep ravine could be seen in the middle of her snow-white breasts. It was a dazzling sight. John recognized her at a glance. Wasn't this Alba, the school's cheerleader? Wasn't she the one who hated Chris the most? Why did he come here to join in the fun? Chris was the president of the student council and a famous campus belle. She came from a good family and had a good personality. Almost all the boys acknowledged that Chris was the best of the best. Any man who married her would be blessed by the heavens. They would be able to fight for at least 30 years less. Because of this, Chris was extremely popular in the university and was called the Goddess of Pennsylvania by the boys. She had been Miss Pennsylvania of the Year for 3 years in a row. However, the more outstanding a girl was, the more she could attract the attention of the opposite sex and the hostility of the same sex. Alba, the cheerleader in front of her, was Chris' famous nemesis at the University of Pennsylvania. For the past 3 years in a row, Chris had won the Miss Penn Award over Alba by a narrow margin. In private, Alba gnashed her teeth in hatred. More than once, she had privately cursed Chris for being a dignified and beautiful B*TCH. From her point of view, Chris already had everything, but she just had to fight with her for the title of Miss Best of the Year, which was the icing on the cake for Chris but a timely help to her. To be able to obtain this kind of title in a well-known university many times, for a girl from an ordinary family with no power, no background, it was a kind of rich capital. But this kind of capital that should have fallen on her had been endlessly deprived by crazy. How could Alba not gnash her teeth in hatred? At this time, Alba was looking at Chris with a very jealous gaze. She said in a very sarcastic tone, "Chris, I didn't know that you were so wild. You actually want to elope?" Although John was a little unhappy, he still raised his hands and said, "Hey, Alba, can you not involve me in the battle between you two?" Alba glanced at John and suddenly smiled at him. "Ah, I know you. You're John from the combat club. Your performance at the gala was pretty good." Although John was big, he was not stupid. He knew that Alba mistakenly thought that he was Chris's boyfriend and wanted to dig up his past to humiliate Chris. Then, she would dump him later. John quickly took a step back and said, "Alba, Chris and I have some private things to talk about. Can you do me a favor?" Alba was quite beautiful and had a very South American appearance. She giggled and said, "How can there be so many private things? Why are you two so unnatural when I come here? What are you talking about?" As she spoke, Alba glanced around and saw the inner cannon of the Yellow Emperor in Chris's hands. She smiled and said, "What book is this? Is it a book of witchcraft and magic?" Chris knew that Alba had always hated her and would make things difficult for her every time they met. She knew that once she made things difficult for Alba, everyone would immediately say that she was bullying others. Therefore, she had been enduring and giving in. No matter what Alba said, she would remain silent. When Alba saw that Chris was ignoring her, she felt a little bored, but she was unwilling to leave. She quickly snatched the inner cannon of the Yellow Emperor from Chris's hands when Chris was not paying attention. Then, she turned around and flipped through it. As soon as she opened it, she was dazzled by the dense square characters inside. Alba curled her lips, threw the book on the ground disdainfully, and said, "What rubbish is this? Chris, are you wasting your life by looking at these things every day? Chris frowned slightly. She bent down, picked up the book on the ground, and carefully and seriously patted the dust off it. She said seriously, Alba, you can disrespect me, but you can't disrespect this book. Alba sneered and said, what kind of witchcraft book is it that you value so much? John couldn't help but say angrily, Alba, this is a book that Grandma Chris gave her. Chris shook her head at John, motioning for him not to speak. Then, she said seriously to Alba, Alba, this book is called The Inner Canon of the Yellow Emperor. It comes from China. It is the earliest medical book recorded in the history of human beings on this planet. You can disrespect people, but please respect history and science. Alba curled her lips and said, TSK, what do you mean by the earliest medical book? From China? And science? In my opinion, it's just a black book full of witchcraft and superstition that records the backwardness and ignorance. Ever since John had seen Li Jiandong's magic, he had been full of yearning and longing for the mysterious country of China. He couldn't bear to hear someone slander this country, so he couldn't help but say angrily, Alba, is your period coming or has your boyfriend dumped you? What are you doing here? We're having a good conversation. What does it have to do with you? Alba's face changed drastically, and she screamed, this is the capital of a free country. It's none of your business where I want to go. Don't you want to go to that damn feudal country? Go, don't stay in this land of freedom. John was furious. It's none of your business where I go. A look of displeasure flashed across Chris's face. She said in a low voice, Alba, we don't welcome you. Please leave. Alba gritted her teeth and said, I'm relying on you. What are you going to do? Chris had never seen such a scoundrel before. She shook her head with a wry smile and said to John, forget it, let's go. John was so angry that he laughed. Alba, we're going to China. If you have the guts, come with us. A strange look appeared on Alba's face. She looked at the backs of Chris and John as they turned to leave. She gritted her teeth and said loudly, if you have the guts, tell me when to go. John laughed without turning his head. Tomorrow. Chris was shocked and quickly tugged at John's sleeve. Hey, are you crazy? Are you leaving tomorrow? John said curiously, don't you have a passport and can go abroad at any time? I've already got mine. If you want to go, go as soon as possible. Of course, this kind of thing should be done as soon as possible. Otherwise, if you delay for a few more days, you won't want to go, right? Although Chris felt that it was a little hasty, she felt that what John said was reasonable. In addition, the wild spirit of adventure flowing in her blood made her a little excited. Chris nodded slightly. Well, I'll go back and pack my luggage. Then I'll book a plane ticket tonight. John laughed heartily. Then it's a deal. After that, he turned to Alba and laughed loudly. Alba, we're going to China tomorrow. If you have the guts, come with us. Alba watched as John laughed arrogantly and left. She stamped her feet, cursed him, and then left angrily. The next day, John and Chris made an appointment to meet at the airport. They were about to board the plane when they suddenly saw a familiar figure dragging a suitcase and walking up to them, looking at them proudly. It was Alba. Chris and John were both stunned. Chris stared at Alba with her eyes wide open and stammered, Alba, what are you doing? Alba flipped her long brown hair and said proudly, didn't you say that I would come with you if I had the guts? Ha, I'm coming with you. John's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. He stammered, Alba, are you crazy? Do you know how far China is? Aren't you afraid that your family will worry about you? Alba rolled her eyes at John. It's none of your business. Anyway, I'm here now. What are you going to do? Chris was stunned and said, but, how did you know which flight we took? As soon as she finished speaking, she came to her senses and turned to glare at John. John, did you tell her? John shrugged, spread his hands, and said with a wry smile, I didn't think she would come with us. Even if she wanted to, she wouldn't have a passport. But I didn't expect. Damn it, is this woman crazy? What is she doing here? Just because she's angry with us? Alba ignored the two of them and dragged her small suitcase to the gate. Guys, it's time to board the plane, she said. Now we're going through thick and thin together. As she spoke, she walked forward as if she were the leader of the team. Chris couldn't help but press her forehead with her hand and groan. Oh my God, what the hell is going on? John whispered with a wry smile, why don't we get rid of her again and secretly change to another flight? As soon as he finished speaking, Alba turned her head and shouted angrily, don't even think about getting rid of me. Chris and John looked at each other and shook their heads with wry smiles at the same time. Then, they dragged their luggage to the gate. Chris couldn't help sighing. John, I have a bad feeling that our trip to China is going to be very, very bad. John also turned his head and said with a bitter smile, I agree. I can't imagine what Master will do if he sees the three of us. Oh my God, he will definitely kick me out of the door. Chris rolled her eyes at him. Has he ever accepted you as an apprentice? Vote recommendation previous page return to table of contents next page error report if you like it. Please click here to add Keeping a Fox at Home to your bookshelf so that you can read the latest chapters and updates of Keeping a Fox at Home in the future. If you have any suggestions or comments on Keeping a Fox at Home, please click here to express your views. Chapter 462. Go to CNET. It was supposed to be a wonderful and exciting trip, but now there was a third party. Both Chris and John felt very uncomfortable, as if they had swallowed a fly. However, Alba was sitting right between them, which made the atmosphere very awkward for a while. Go to CNET. Chris and John sighed inwardly and closed their eyes. They didn't want to talk to Alba. They were going to pretend to be dead all the way to China. But after the plane took off, Chris, who was resting with her eyes closed, suddenly heard Alba crying in a low voice next to her. Puzzled and curious, she opened her eyes and took a look, only to see Alba lying on the seat of the plane, sobbing and wiping away her tears. Although Chris didn't know what had happened, she still kindly handed over a tissue. When Alba saw the tissue, she took it without raising her head and held it tightly in her hand. However, she didn't wipe away her tears and just kept crying. Chris couldn't help but ask, Alba, if you miss home, you might as well book a ticket back as soon as you get off the plane. I'll pay for you. Alba raised her head. Her tears had ruined the makeup on her face. She cried, why are you pretending to be a good person? Chris sighed helplessly. No matter what, we are all classmates. If you go to China with us, we can't just leave you behind, can we? What's wrong with you? Alba looked at Chris in a daze. Suddenly, she pouted and threw herself into Chris's arms with an aggrieved look on her face. She cried loudly, Chris, Jack, that B*TCH, dumped me for a whore. Chris smiled bitterly. John really hit the nail on the head? You didn't go to China with us because of this, did you? Alba burst into tears. I feel like a big joke. How could he do this to me? Chris sighed helplessly and patiently comforted her mortal enemy. It's fine. Maybe you can start a new relationship in China. John's hostility towards Alba had also dissipated a lot. He winked and said, by the way, Alba, I know a lot of handsome guys in China. Do you want me to introduce you to some of them? Chris glared at him. Shut up. Who else do you know besides your master? And I know the mayor, cried John. Chris remembered how John had greeted Mayor Luo and laughed. Yes, if you're not afraid of being arrested and thrown into prison, you can go find him. After crying for a while, Alba calmed down a lot. She wiped her tears and said to Chris, Chris, I'm sorry. I was dumped by Jack yesterday and I was in a bad mood. I just wanted to find someone to vent my anger on. I was a little rude. I apologize. Chris generously stretched out her hand to Alba. Let's not talk about the past. Let's be friends now, okay? Even if you're just a friend in China, will you still be an enemy when you come back? Alba looked at Chris's outstretched hand and suddenly laughed. She also reached out and shook hands with Chris. Well, let's make a truce for the time being. This beautiful South American woman's mood came and went quickly. She quickly sat up straight, wiped the tears off her face, opened her small bag, and carefully touched up her makeup in front of the mirror. When she was done, she said to John excitedly, "Hey, are you really going to China to elope? Wow, that's so romantic." When John saw Alba crying and laughing at the drop of a hat, he couldn't help but smile bitterly. "Alba, don't play with me. Chris and I are just friends. We're going to China to be apprenticed to a master." Alba blinked and asked curiously, "Apprenticed to what master?" When it came to apprenticing, John became a little excited. He turned around and said excitedly, "We're going to be apprenticed to a very, very powerful Chinese man." Alba became more and more curious. "How powerful? In what way?" John waved his hands and said, "He can dodge bullets within 5 meters, catch people falling from the 5th floor with his bare hands, and deal with dozens of gangsters with his bare hands." Alba couldn't help laughing. "John, you're talking about Superman. He's not in China, he's in Hollywood." John couldn't help but say angrily, "Alba, I'm not joking with you." Alba stopped smiling and looked at John with a strange expression. "I'm not joking with you. Superman is really in Hollywood." John was so angry that he shouted, "What I just said is true. If you don't believe me, ask Chris." Alba saw that John's angry face didn't seem to be fake, so she turned to look at Chris and asked tentatively, "Is it true?" Chris also nodded seriously. "It's true. We saw it with our own eyes. I used to take pictures of it with my mobile phone, but unfortunately, the teacher at the university where I was an exchange student confiscated my memory card, so. Alas, I could have won the Pulitzer Prize for journalism." Alba couldn't help shaking her head. She smiled and said, "Impossible, I don't believe it. How could there be such a person in this world?" Chris smiled slightly. "Alba, you'll know when you see him." Alba smiled and said, "If there really is such a person, then I'll also be apprenticed to him." As soon as she finished speaking, John burst out laughing. "That's impossible." Alba was a little unconvinced. "Why not?" she asked. John looked at Chris, and Chris happened to look at him as well. The two of them laughed in unison. "Because you can't speak Chinese." Alba stared at him with her blue eyes and said, "What does speaking Chinese have to do with not being apprenticed to him?" John said gloatingly, "This is Master's rule. He said that if you want to learn his kung fu, you must first learn Chinese, or he won't teach you." Alba frowned. "Can't I even hire an interpreter?" John laughed and shook his finger. No, of course not." Alba was tongue-tied. "Is it too late for me to learn it now?" John became more and more proud. "Chinese is very difficult to learn. It's too late to learn it now. Besides, even if you learn it, Master may not accept you." Alba frowned. "Why is that?" John pointed at Chris. "Chris's Chinese is good enough, isn't it? Why didn't Master accept her at the beginning?" "Because Master said that his kung fu is only passed on to men, not women." Alba was originally stubborn and extreme, and she also had some feminist ideas. When she heard this, she immediately became angry. Regardless of the fact that she was on the plane, she stood up and said angrily, "What kind of man is this? What era are we in? How can there still be such rotten ideas? You want to be apprenticed to such a person? Oh my God, are you all out of your minds?" She was tall, so when she stood up on the plane, she really stood out. All the people on the plane looked at her in unison. The stewardess immediately walked up to her and whispered with a smile, "Hello, madam. Please keep your voice down." "Thank you." Seeing that everyone was staring at her, Alba forced a smile and sat down angrily. She still kept complaining in a low voice, "What's the big deal? This is obviously sexism." She complained in a low voice for a while, then turned to look at Chris and asked in confusion, "Hey, you know that it's unlikely that you will be his apprentice, so why did you go to China?" Chris was still focused on the inner cannon of the Yellow Emperor in her hand. With a faint expression, she said in Chinese, "Nothing in the world is difficult for those who set their minds to it." Alba was confused. "What?" John, who was standing to one side, giggled. He explained this sentence in English with a smile, and then said with a smile, "There's another saying." John said in Chinese, "Sincerity can break open metal and stone." Alba stared at him as if she were looking at an alien and said, "What? What? Say it again." John repeated the words carefully, word by word. Alba followed him like a parrot, but no matter how hard she tried, it was very difficult to pronounce. After repeating it a few times, Alba covered her face with her hands and lamented, "Oh my God, I feel like my tongue is tied in a bow. I'm starting to regret going to this country with you. How am I going to talk to these Chinese people who can tie bow knots with their tongues in the future?" Chris held back her laughter and said lightly, "When you get off the plane in Shanghai, you can take the earliest flight. I'll buy you a ticket." Alba immediately put down her hands, stared at her, and said, "Don't even think about getting rid of me. I won't run away. No matter what, I have to see what this hateful, damned misogynist bastard looks like. I also want to scold him for his male chauvinism and his decadent and old-fashioned ideas. I want him to know that he lives in the 21st century, not in the damned ancient society." Hearing this, John turned pale with fright and quickly said, "No, no, Master will be angry. He is very powerful. You can't make him angry." Alba glanced at John and asked, "Why are you so nervous?" Soon, Alba suddenly understood and said, "Oh, you're afraid that if I make him angry, he won't accept you as his disciple, right?" John nodded with a wry smile on his face. Alba laughed proudly and said, "Ha ha ha, from now on, I'm the leader of this small team. If any of you don't listen to me, I'll make trouble. I'll make sure you can't become my disciple." John slapped his forehead with his hand and groaned in pain, "My God, why did I send you the flight details?" John turned his head to look at Chris with a pained expression, only to see that the blonde beauty was still calmly reading her book. He couldn't help but ask, "Chris, aren't you worried?" Chris sighed softly and said, "What's there to worry about?" Alba smiled triumphantly and said, "That's right. Hey, John, from now on, you are my subordinate. You have to listen to me, otherwise, Before she could finish her words, Chris said slowly, "I heard that a large number of people go missing in China every year. I believe one more American is no big deal." The smile on Alba's face froze, and John, who was beside her, laughed wildly. After laughing for a while, he suddenly put on a serious face and said to Chris, "Chris, why don't we bury Alba behind the airport after we get off the plane?" Chris also closed her book and said seriously, "No, it's better to put her in the suitcase." John frowned and said, "Alba is too tall, and she has a big skeleton and a lot of meat. What if we can't put her in?" Chris snapped her fingers and said, "Haven't you seen Texas Chainsaw Massacre?" Alba looked at the two people beside her and couldn't help but say angrily, "You two murderers, can you not say such things in front of the people involved when you are planning to kill?" As she said this, Alba's voice suddenly rose by an octave. She pointed at John and said in a shrill voice, "John, explain to me clearly. What do you mean by my big skeleton and a lot of meat?" Chris finally couldn't hold it in any longer. She convulsed with laughter. Alba gnashed her teeth and said, "You two bastards, don't try to scare me. When I see this guy, I will definitely scold him until he's all black and blue." Chapter 463. Go to watch net. The three of them chatted and laughed. After a day on the plane, they finally arrived at Shanghai's Hongqiao Airport. As soon as they got off the plane, Alba, who was tired all the way, shouted to find a hotel to stay in, but Chris and John, who had just returned to China, were full of energy and excitement. Watch net. 7 KOM. Hardadef denied Alba's words and said, No, it's morning now. We have to hurry to Master's City as soon as possible. It's quite far from here. Chris also looked at her watch and said, Well, now this country's high-speed rail is the fastest in the world. I believe we should be able to reach Tiannan City from Shanghai by noon. We can even make it to Tiannan University for lunch there. John shouted exaggeratedly, Oh my God, the food in this school is terrible. I'll starve to death if I line up. Chris shrugged. Then let's eat near the school. Hardadef said with a smile, Good idea, my treat. Alba couldn't help but say angrily, Are you too used to ignoring me? Aren't you afraid that I'll make trouble for you? Chris and John turned their heads at the same time and looked at Alba strangely. The two of them suddenly started talking in Chinese. John said, Chris, I think we'd better use the method in Saw. Chris shook her head. That's too bloody. John said exaggeratedly, Isn't the Texas Chainsaw Murderer bloody? Chris said seriously, I think it's better if you teach her a few curses, and then let her go to the gate of the Chinese government to greet those officials. As long as she does this, she will be sent back to her country immediately if she isn't thrown into a black prison. Hardadef chuckled mischievously. That's a good idea, I like it. Alba saw the two of them talking furtively in Chinese and laughing sinisterly from time to time. Although she couldn't understand what they were talking about, she still felt creeped out. She raised her hands high and said in surrender, Okay, I won't make trouble. Don't murmur about plotting to kill me in Chinese. John laughed. Alba, you're so smart. Alba was so angry that she kicked John. You bastard, I curse you to fall off a cliff and die. John chuckled. I don't do mountain climbing or bungee jumping. Alba rolled her eyes at him. Of course I know. Otherwise, how would I dare to make such a curse? My curse is very effective. Chris tried to smooth things over by saying, Okay, let's go take the high-speed train. It's getting late. The three of them dragged their luggage and walked quickly towards the train station. The man was tall and the woman was beautiful. They attracted many people's attention along the way. When they arrived at Tiannan City, the three of them stopped a taxi. Chris got in the car and said, Sir, please go to Tiannan University. When the taxi driver saw that such a beautiful foreign girl could speak fluent Chinese, he was shocked. He didn't dare to cheat her, so he drove the car to the school gate. At this time, the school was over at noon. The three of them stood in the crowd of black heads, which was really eye-catching, attracting the attention of the surrounding teachers and students. Alba looked at the gate and the buildings of Tiannan University with a critical face and kept shaking her head. Oh my God, this school is at least 50 years behind us. Can this school produce a Superman? I don't believe it. John was very excited when he thought that he would see Li Yundong soon. It was rare that he didn't bicker with her. He just looked around as if he wanted to find Li Yundong's figure. Chris, who was standing on her tiptoes, was also looking into the distance. After looking for a while, she suddenly saw a familiar figure. She immediately waved her arms in surprise and shouted, Fong! Fong! She shouted a few times, but the other party ignored her. Only then did she realize that she had called the wrong person, so she shouted again, Fong Na! Fong Na, who was talking with Cheng Cheng in the school and walking out of the school, heard the shout. She raised her head and curiously looked in the direction of the voice. When she saw who it was, she was suddenly stunned. Chris? Why is she here? Is the school having an exchange activity again? Cheng Cheng, who was standing to the side, rolled her eyes. She snorted and said with a very ambiguous smile, The foreign horse is here to steal your lover. Fong Na glared at her. My man? I don't have a lover. Cheng Cheng said with a smirk, Don't pretend. She's your dream lover, you know. The smile on Feng Na's face suddenly faded. She sighed softly and said, "It's not my turn. Don't make such a joke. I don't even dare to dream about such a thing. Come on, let's go see Chris. I don't know why they're here." Feng Na and Ching Cheng had attended Zhou Qin's birthday party with Chris and the others, so they had a good relationship in private. When they parted ways, they had exchanged gifts with each other. Feng Na greeted her with a smile and said in English, "Chris, why are you here?" However, Chris replied in Chinese with a smile on her face, "I'm here for Li Yundong." After she finished speaking, Ching Cheng, who was beside her, quietly pinched Feng Na's arm. Feng Na glanced at Ching Cheng and sighed in her heart. She still replied politely in English, "Chris, did you come all the way here just to see Li Yundong?" Chris didn't know that the girl in front of her was already a little jealous. She blinked and said, "Yes, I came to find him." John also came over and said, "I also came to find him." Alba didn't want to be left out. She leaned over and said seriously, "I came to scold him." Feng Na looked at Alba with a strange expression and thought to herself, "Who is this woman? Is she crazy?" Although Feng Na felt strange, she still smiled politely at Alba and then said to Chris, "Li Yundong hasn't been to school for a long time." Chris and John were shocked at the same time. What? He dropped out of school? Feng Na shook her head. No, he just went through the formalities of suspension. John smiled bitterly. Damn it, what should we do? Where did he go? Chris quickly asked, "What is he doing now?" Feng Na's eyes showed strong admiration, and she said proudly, "He has opened a tea house of his own. I went there last time it opened." Ching Ching also showed off excitedly, although she had used this matter more than once. Do you know who went to the opening ceremony? The secretary of the provincial party committee, the top leader. Ah, it's equivalent to your governor. Governor. Chris, Alba, and John exclaimed in surprise at the same time and looked at each other. In the United States, politicians like governors often made some show of being close to the people, and it was not uncommon for them to see or even talk to the governor. However, it was not a small matter for any enterprise to invite a governor for the opening. This was a manifestation of resources and connections. Chris knew that Li Yundong was extraordinary and had superhuman strength, but she didn't know that he had such a political background. She was stunned for a moment and asked, "Where is this tea house? Can you take us there?" Feng Na and Ching Cheng looked at each other, then Feng Na smiled and said, "Okay, I'll call him and see if he's there." She took out her cell phone and made a call, but no one answered. Feng Na couldn't help but say angrily, "That be asterisk starred. I told him last time not to use his cell phone as a landline, but he didn't listen." She said helplessly to Chris, "Forget it, let's go straight to him. His tea house has only been open for less than a month. I believe that he should be taking care of the business in the tea house every day. If we go there and take advantage of him, it can be considered as robbing the rich to help the poor." Chris smiled slightly. Okay. John also shouted excitedly, "Master has opened a tea house. That's amazing. I want to go and have tea too." Only Alba, who was dragging her luggage, shouted, Hey, are you going to run around with your luggage?" However, after complaining for a while, she saw that Chris and John were talking and laughing with Feng Na and Ching Cheng, ignoring her at all. She immediately stomped her feet resentfully and chased after them angrily. When the group arrived at the Desangxian tea house on the pedestrian street of Tiannan City, Feng Na was surprised to find that the door of the Desangxian tea house was closed. She was shocked and quickly found the receptionist of Zhao's tea house across the street. "Hello, may I ask why the tea house across the street isn't open?" The receptionist said gloatingly, "It's been closed for 16 days. Feng Na turned pale with fright. "What happened?" The receptionist shook her head slightly. "I don't know." Feng Na was stunned. It took her a while to react. She forced a smile at the receptionist and said, "Thank you, sorry to disturb you." When she turned around and walked back, she heard the receptionist at the door whisper, according to them, it would be strange if they didn't close the door. That's right. How can they solicit customers like that? Hearing this, Feng Na felt strange. She turned her head to look at them, only to see that the receptionists were looking straight ahead, as if they hadn't said anything at all. Feng Na was suspicious, and Chris, who was next to her, also asked in surprise, Feng Na, what happened? Feng Na shook her head with a worried expression. I don't know, but something must have happened. Damn it, I don't know where Li Yundong lives, and he doesn't answer my phone. What should I do? What should I do? Alba saw that the two of them were speaking Chinese, so she pulled Hardadef to translate. After listening, she sneered and said, this guy named Li Yundong must be afraid that I'll scold him, so he's hiding like a coward. When Feng Na and Ching Cheng heard this, they immediately became furious and glared at Alba. Just as Feng Na was about to retort, she suddenly heard two people coming over and whispering to each other, this Jinren Li is really cautious. For the Taoist assembly, he actually handed over the shop to those coquettish foxes early. Now he's even closed the shop. Hey, do you think he's preparing some powerful magic treasure? It's possible, but no matter how much he prepares, it's useless. Hey, Shixiang is really worrying for nothing. Once his powerful magical weapon is refined, no matter how capable Li Yundong is, he will have to admit defeat. That's not necessarily true. Jinren Li's ability is not just for show. He has to fight. Humph, what do you mean by fighting? There are so many coquettish foxes around this guy. Even if he can fight, the iron pestle will be ground into embroidery needles. When the Taoist assembly comes, his legs will be weak. How can he fight? Speaking of this, the two of them giggled in a low voice. When Feng Na heard them mention Jinren Li, her heart suddenly skipped a beat. She remembered that at the opening ceremony, hadn't someone also called Li Yundong Jinren Li? She thought to herself, could the Jinren Li these two guys are talking about be Li Yundong? Thinking of this, Feng Na couldn't help stepping forward and asking, hello, is the Jinren Li you're talking about Li Yundong? The two of them hadn't expected that their casual conversation would be overheard by Feng Na. They were slightly shocked, looked Feng Na up and down, and asked warily, who are you? Chapter 464. Go to Watch Network. Feng Na smiled and said, I'm Li Yundong's friend. Then, she turned around and pointed at Chris and John, saying, my friend and I have something urgent to discuss with him. The two of them looked at each other, and one of them sneered and said, why are you looking for Li Yundong? When John heard their conversation, he leaned over and said, I'm looking for my master. I'm his disciple. The two men's expressions changed at the same time, and they exclaimed, you're Li Yundong's disciple? John had even dared to say that he was Li Yundong's disciple in front of Li Yundong, let alone in front of two strangers. He nodded vigorously and said, yes, I'm his disciple. The two men were shocked and angry. They looked at each other and thought, how dare Li Yundong break the rules of the cultivation world and accept a foreigner as his disciple? He's too bold, isn't he? One of them suppressed his anger and said, he may have gone to Dongwu City to participate in the Taoist assembly. You can go and find him yourself. When John heard this, he was overjoyed. Okay, I'll go and find my master right away. After that, he was about to leave. Chris was very careful and quickly asked, may I ask where the Taoist assembly will be held in Dongwu City? The two men saw that Chris had blonde hair and blue eyes. Her figure was exquisite, and her skin was as white as cheese. She was a rare beauty. They were shocked, and one of them asked subconsciously, are you also his disciple? Before Chris could say anything, John rushed to say, yes, so is she. The two of them suddenly gasped and thought with envy and anger, this bastard actually accepted such a beautiful foreign woman as his disciple. This was simply too lawless. Why can't such a good thing happen to me? One of them sneered and said, the Taoist assembly will be held on a tanker in the moat of Dongwu City in 2 days. You'll know when you get to the wharf of Zenshikyo. After that, he snorted angrily and left in a huff. The other man chased after him and whispered, Shixiang, why did you tell them about the Taoist assembly? The man said angrily, didn't you see that they are all Li Yundong's disciples? Since they were all cultivators, what was there to hide? Moreover, Li Yundong, this bastard, was greedy and lustful. He had actually broken the rules of the cultivation world and taken a foreigner as his disciple. How can we not teach him a lesson? The other man asked curiously, what does letting them go to the Taoist assembly have to do with teaching Li Yundong a lesson? The man sneered and said, when Shixiang Wang Lingfei's powerful magical weapon is refined, he will definitely teach Li Yundong a lesson. Heh, what could be more humiliating than losing face in front of his disciple? This Li Yundong should take a piss and look at himself in the mirror. How dare he break the rules of the cultivation world? Even if it's going to be broken, it should be our Zhuni school who will be the first to break it. It's not his turn. Another person also chuckled. That's right. This guy isn't afraid of being coquettish. He raised a vixen at home, and now he's raising a foreign horse. I wonder if he can handle it. It doesn't matter. If he can't handle it, when senior brother Wang defeats him, his disciples will definitely scatter. At that time, we can help him share the burden. After that, both of them burst out laughing. Feng Na and the others didn't know what these two gentle scum of the Zhuni school were up to. They thought that they were kindly instructing them to go to Dongwu City. Feng Na glanced at Chris helplessly and said, Li Yundong should be in Dongwu City to participate in this Taoist assembly. Otherwise, there would be no reason for him to ignore the tea house. You can go to Dongwu City to find him. Chris asked, Feng Na, aren't you going with us? Feng Na shook her head and said with a wry smile, no, Dongwu City is quite far away. We still have things to do, so we can't go. You go by yourselves. I have no other choice. If there's really no other way, let's keep in touch by cell phone. Chris thought for a moment and said, well, give me your cell phone number. After exchanging cell phone numbers, they parted ways and left. Alba hadn't expected that her journey would be bumpy. Not only could she not rest in the hotel, but she also had to rush to another city. She couldn't help but sigh and complain while dragging her luggage. In her heart, she had already cursed Li Yundong 10,000 times. Chris ignored her. She just pulled Hardadef and whispered, Hardadef, how can you say that we are Li Yundong's disciples in front of others? Hardadef said proudly, Chris, Chinese people are very proud. If I say this, everyone will know that I, Hardadef, am his disciple. He has no choice but to accept me. Hee, it's the same for you. You should thank me. Chris rubbed her temples with her hands and said in Chinese with a wry smile, you are a simple-minded fool. You will definitely cause trouble. Don't you know that Chinese people are very serious about apprenticing? This is called acting first and reporting later. It's very impolite and stupid. Li Yundong will definitely be angry. Be careful not to be fooled by your cleverness. Hardadef was shocked and said with some fear, really? Then why didn't you stop me just now? Chris glared at him and said, could I have stopped you? You spoke so fast. Hardadef said with a wry smile, then what should I do? What if Master is really angry and refuses to accept me? Should we still go to Dongwu City? Chris rolled her eyes at him and said, you came all the way from the United States. Don't you want to go to Dongwu City? Don't you know that there is a saying that when things come to a head, you need to be brave? The two of them whispered, but Alba, who was following them, couldn't understand what they were talking about in Chinese. She couldn't help shouting, hey, what are you talking about? Don't use Chinese, okay? Can you use a language I can understand? Hey, I'm talking to you. Hey, what are you talking about? What do you mean by, when things get wet, you need to be brave? Why can't I understand? The three foreigners walked all the way to Dongwu City. At this time, on the distant Mount Wuhua, Jing Yuan, the leader of the Yinyang sect, was carefully guarding in front of a stove, staring at the fire in it. Next to him stood Ding Nan, who was holding a golden silk palm leaf fan. The stove in front of Zheng Yuan was about 2 meters high. Its lower plate was a 3-legged support frame, and in the middle was a gourd-shaped round body. Its surroundings were dark, as if it were made of black iron. There was a blazing flame burning under the relatively wide round body of the gourd. There was an air vent in the furnace, and above the primordial spirit was a relatively narrow part, where the powerful magical weapon to be refined was suspended in the air. Exquisite patterns were engraved around the fireplace, and in the middle of the fireplace, there was a transparent window made of glazed sand, allowing people to look inside. Zheng Yuan looked at the situation inside the stove without blinking. He saw that the Rui jade was surrounded by blazing flames and a black aura. This black aura was constantly twisting under the burning flames. From time to time, it would change into a ferocious face, and from time to time, it would linger around the Rui jade and change into a trace of strange black lines engraved on it. However, more of the black aura was always wandering around the outside of the Rui jade, refusing to linger around it. It was like a vengeful spirit that had broken free from hell, constantly struggling to escape. After watching for a while, Zheng Yuan shouted without looking back, "Wind!" Hearing this, Ding Nan immediately fanned the golden silk palm leaf fan in her hand toward the air vent. Ding Nan had been cultivating with Zheng Yuan for a while. Her aptitude was excellent, and with the help of all kinds of elixirs and miraculous medicines, the Xianyin Yuanqi in her body was not weak at all. She was only one step away from the Zhuji phase. As she fanned, the whole room was filled with a strong wind, as if a matrix vortex had appeared. This vortex swirled the air in the room crazily, and then gathered into a fist-sized eye of the wind and drilled into the air vent. As soon as the wind entered, the flames in the stove immediately flared up, forcibly driving back the black fog that was trying to escape. The stove fire was so strong that the entire Rui jade and the black fog were enveloped in it. Zheng Yuan saw a blazing red flame in front of him, and he subconsciously covered his eyes with his hands. When he put his hands down again, he saw that all the black fog around the Rui jade had disappeared. The Rui jade was still suspended in the middle of the stove, crystal clear. Ding Nan also took a closer look curiously and asked, "Why is there no movement, master? Do you still want to fan it?" Zheng Yuan waved his hand nervously at Ding Nan and said, "Don't fan it yet. Let me take a look." Zheng Yuan opened the mouth of the stove and took out the Rui jade with his shinchi. He took a closer look and saw that the Rui jade was slightly red from the heat, but the strange black lines that had been branded on it before could not be seen on its body. He immediately said to Ding Nan, "Quick, take the 9th Earth Mystic Yin method and pour it on it." Ding Nan immediately took a wooden bucket from the side and poured it on the Rui jade. As soon as it was poured, the Rui jade let out an extremely shrill roar and instantly released countless black ghosts. The faces of each ghost were twisted and ferocious, and they opened their mouths wide and roared wildly. Ding Nan was so frightened that she took 3 steps back. Her 3 souls and 7 spirits almost flew out of her body in fright. However, these ghosts only leaped out for a moment, and soon flew back on their own. When Ding Nan looked at it again, she saw that the Rui jade had returned to its original state, but from time to time, layers of dense and strange black patterns would appear all over its body. Zheng Yuan held the Rui jade in his hand and laughed proudly. "It's done, it's finally done. I've been refining it with the fire of 9 yang for 49 days, with the help of the ghosts of 81 boys and girls, and with the help of the 9th Earth Mystic Yin method, this powerful magical weapon has finally been refined." Ding Nan stared at the powerful magical weapon in Zheng Yuan's hand with her eyes wide open. She knew that Zheng Yuan had killed many children in an extremely cruel way and refined their Yin spirits to refine this powerful magical weapon. She couldn't help but ask, "Master, this powerful magical weapon you refined, what magical power does it have?" Zheng Yuan carefully hid the Rui jade close to his body and smiled proudly. "Hehe, the Taoist assembly is in 2 days. You'll know then." Ding Nan asked tentatively, "Is it very powerful?" Zheng Yuan laughed and said, of course it is. Ding Nan asked again, how powerful is it? Can it be more powerful than Li Yundong? Zheng Yuan sneered disdainfully and said, Li Yundong? Humph, with this powerful magical weapon of mine, even if Taoist Zhang of the Jingyi school came in person, he could only run away and not dare to fight with me. Li Yundong is a little bastard who has only cultivated for a few days. Who does he think he is? See how I will deal with him at the Taoist assembly and avenge you. Ding Nan was a little worried in her heart, but she didn't dare to show the slightest expression on her face. She said with a flattering smile, Master, of course, Li Yundong is no match for you. But there will definitely be experts from various sects at the Taoist assembly. Will you be able to handle them? Zheng Yuan smiled and said, my powerful magical weapon is not invincible in the world. If we only consider powerful magical weapons, there are too many that are better than mine. The Sanhuang sword of the Qingqing sect, the seven-star sword of the Jingyi school, the Bahuang and Liuhe sword of the Linggong sect, the lost Xianyuan sword, the disaster-releasing divine sword of the Buddhist sect, and other powerful magical weapons can definitely defeat my powerful magical weapon. Zheng Yuan's tone changed and he said proudly, however, in terms of magical weapons, the law comes first, and the weapon comes second. We fight with the law, not the weapon. No matter how powerful a magical weapon is, it depends on who is using it. Humph, my good disciple, when the Taoist assembly comes, I will show you what real magic is and what real fighting methods are. Hearing this, Ding Nan pretended to be happy and said with a flattering smile, I hope you will show your power and defeat all the heroes. Zheng Yuan laughed out loud. He stroked his beard and pretended to be modest as he said, of course, there are also some experts in each sect. For example, Yu Sheng, who is known as the top master of the younger generation of the Chuanjin Dragon sect, Zhang Tianhe and Wang Lingfei of the Jingyi school, and Zhang Tsuni, the future leader of the Qingqing sect, who said that he would take first place a while ago. Most of them have powerful magical weapons in their hands, so we can't take them lightly. Ding Nan smiled and said, although they are powerful, they are not as powerful as your powerful magical weapons and magical powers, right? This flattery made Zheng Yuan feel refreshed. He smiled proudly and said, good disciple, let's go now. I can't wait for the Taoist assembly. Chapter 465. Go to Watch Network. After walking in the wind and snow for a day and night, Zhou Qin finally arrived at the foot of Kari Holy Mountain. Watch Net. Kari Holy Mountain, located in the south of Lhasa and the north bank of the Yarlung-Zangbo River, was one of the 4 famous holy mountains in Tibet. Because it stood majestically in the forest, it was like a sharp sword rising into the sky, towering into the clouds, majestic and magnificent, so it was called Kari, which meant touching the sky. Zhou Qin raised her head and looked at the majestic holy mountain. She looked up from the foot of the mountain and saw a mark that seemed to have been cut by a knife near the top of the holy mountain. In some of the ancient books that Zhou Qin had read, she clearly remembered that this was left by the famous hero of Tibet, King Gezer, who had shot the rock to death with an arrow. Therefore, it was called Folding Winter by the world, which meant an arrow sheath. Although Zhou Qin had failed to build her foundation before, the Xianing qi running wildly in her body had been soothed in time. Most of it had run into Meidua's body, so it had not caused much damage to Zhou Qin's meridians. Moreover, Zhou Qin had a strong and resolute character. She was not discouraged at all because of her first failure to build her foundation. On the contrary, when she came to the foot of Kari Holy Mountain, the majestic holy mountain between heaven and earth brought her infinite pride. I want to conquer this holy mountain. At the beginning, at the foot of the mountain, because there were many trees and stone paths for worshippers to walk on, it was not difficult to climb. But when Zhou Qin climbed to the mountainside, the slope of the hillside suddenly increased. The snow on the hillside made Zhou Qin step on it, and almost half of her body could not be seen. But this was not the most difficult thing. When Zhou Qin climbed more than 1,000 meters, there was almost no road on the top of the mountain, and the hillside was so steep that it almost became a vertical angle. If it were an ordinary person, they would have given up at this time, but Zhou Qin only wanted to reach the top. She climbed up the almost vertical cliff with both hands and feet. Kari Holy Mountain was the tallest of the 4 holy mountains in Tibet. Zhou Qin was climbing the mountain, which was thousands of meters above sea level. She was surrounded by the biting cold wind. A gust of wind could almost freeze her fingers and make them numb. However, Zhou Qin seemed to be unaware of it. She still gritted her teeth and climbed up. Her delicate body was almost like a piece of grass on the cliff, as if it would be blown away at any time. Watching Zhou Qin climb up the mountain range from a distance, Wan Hongling and Zhou Qin couldn't help but break out in a cold sweat for her. They didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. Wan Hongling said nervously in a low voice, "Sister Ziyuan, is she crazy? Why did he have to climb so high? You don't have to climb to the top of the mountain to build your foundation, right?" Ziyuan also looked at Zhou Qin nervously. She knew that if anything happened to Zhou Qin, even if she could fly over and save her, Zhou Qin would never be able to reach the Zhuji phase in this lifetime. Zhou Qin is challenging the limits of cultivation. Ziyuan murmured in a low voice. She could vaguely feel why Zhou Qin suddenly wanted to climb to the top of Kari Holy Mountain like a madwoman. What was hidden in this girl's heart that made her want to surpass everything without a care for her own safety? The two of them widened their eyes as they watched Zhou Qin climb up bit by bit. From a distance, they could only see a small black spot on the snow-white Kari Holy Mountain, constantly climbing and squirming. Although Zhou Qin had been reborn from Jin Dan at this time, her strength and aura had surpassed that of ordinary people by several times or even more than 10 times. In front of heaven and earth, she was as small as a speck of dust. But it was such a speck of dust that she wanted to conquer the peak of heaven and earth. Several times, Wan Hongling thought that Zhou Qin was going to fall into the valley. Several times, she wanted to rush over to save her, but several times, she found that Zhou Qin had lost her balance due to the strong wind and turned back. Ziyuan looked at Zhou Qin with a moved expression. She couldn't imagine how a delicate woman like Zhou Qin could withstand such a terrible power of heaven and earth in such a cold environment. How could she withstand such a bitter and difficult physical torture? After a long time, when Wan Hongling saw that Zhou Qin had finally climbed to the top of the mountain, she finally couldn't help but sigh with a shocked face. "Sister Ziyuan, I have never admired anyone in my life except you. Today, I admire Zhou Qin. She is really amazing. She can climb such a high mountain with her bare hands when she hasn't reached the Zhuji phase yet." After watching Zhou Qin climb to the top of the mountain, Ziyuan opened her hands as if she wanted to embrace the sky. She shook her head slightly and said, "Zhou Qin must have been stimulated by what happened to Meiduo. It may be the first time she has felt the pain and grievance of not having power, so she wants to climb to the highest peak and reach the highest realm of cultivation. What we cultivators need is a brave and fearless heart like her. I believe that Zhou Qin will definitely succeed in the Zhuji phase this time." As if to prove Ziyuan's words, Zhou Qin, who had her arms wide open, suddenly let out an extremely wild roar. It was hard to believe that this noble princess, who usually paid attention to smiling without showing her teeth, could actually let out such a wild roar. This roar shook the heavens and the earth. The clouds in the sky seemed to be shaken and kept spinning, turning into a colorful vortex. In the center of the vortex, a pair of majestic eyes could be vaguely seen. Ziyuan was shocked and her face changed greatly. "Oh no, Zhou Qin has alarmed the gods of the 9th heaven." But just as she was about to move, Zhou Qin, who had not noticed, found a small cave at the top of the mountain to take shelter from the wind. As soon as she sat down cross-legged in it, she immediately entered a meditative state. As soon as Zhou Qin entered a meditative state, the wind and clouds above her head began to rumble, and the sound of thunder could be heard everywhere. Not long after, bolts of lightning struck down one after another towards the top of Kari Holy Mountain. But as soon as the lightning fell, a colorful golden wheel appeared on the top of Kari Holy Mountain. In this golden wheel, there was a blazing red sun. The golden wheel kept spinning, and the red sun in the middle was like a huge vortex, sucking in one bolt of lightning after another. Ruan Hongling was stunned. She stammered, "What is this?" Ziyuan said solemnly, "This is the red sun golden wheel of the Tibetan esoteric sect. It is the power of the gods formed by the power of their devout faith of the worshippers who have come to carry Holy Mountain to worship for thousands of years. Now this power is automatically resisting the divine punishment." Ruan Hongling was shocked. "Zhou Qin has triggered the divine punishment?" Ziyuan nodded. "Zhou Qin's aura is so strong, and she has climbed so high. She even made such a shout. This is simply a provocation to the gods of the ninth heaven. If the heavenly thunder doesn't strike her, do you think God is easy to bully?" Ruan Hongling was surprised and laughed at the same time. "So Zhou Qin just escaped the tribulation?" Ziyuan also said helplessly, "This may be God's will. I don't know why the gods of Carry Holy Mountain want to help Zhou Qin block the divine punishment." Ruan Hongling shook her head and said, "Thunder is the power of heaven and earth. Every bolt of lightning will leak the spiritual chi of heaven and earth. How much spiritual chi of heaven and earth will leak out from the thunder above Zhou Qin's head? However, Zhou Qin's Zhuji phase will not be struck by the heavenly thunder. This is really a great opportunity. How much spiritual chi of heaven and earth can she absorb in the Zhuji phase?" Ziyuan also sighed. "This is called time and fate. If Zhou Qin hadn't insisted on climbing to the top of the mountain, how could she have attracted the heavenly thunder? If she hadn't wanted to climb the highest Carry Holy Mountain, how could she have triggered the power of the gods to help her resist the divine punishment?" Both of them were silent for a while and sighed in their hearts. After an unknown period of time, the heavenly thunder above Zhou Qin's head gradually stopped, and the clouds hovering in the sky also slowly dissipated unwillingly. But when these clouds were about to dissipate, suddenly there was a dull sound of thunder coming from the top of Carry Holy Mountain. A huge shock wave suddenly exploded at the place where Zhou Qin's Zhuji phase was. This ring of qi continued to spread outwards, layer by layer, like waves. Ziyuan and Ruan Hongling looked from afar and saw that there seemed to be a white halo on the top of Carry Holy Mountain, which was very beautiful. At this time, Zhou Qin let out a long breath. She stood up from the cave and let out an extremely loud and long roar. This long roar was clear and condensed, like the cry of a phoenix from the ninth heaven. It was completely different from the previous roar. It was as if a sword had finally been tempered and was roaring towards the sky. Ziyuan and Ruan Hongling listened to Zhou Qin's long roar from afar. Their faces were solemn and they didn't say a word. Although they were forerunners on the path of cultivation, they were still shocked by the amazing momentum of Zhou Qin, a latecomer. After Zhou Qin finished the Zhuji phase, she seemed to be unsatisfied. She sat down again and began to subdue Qiyue and the Vulcan's whip according to the method Li Yundong had taught her. Zhou Qin herself was a Xianin virgin tripod, a good tripod that was 1 in a million. In addition, Jin Dan had refined her body, and there was Li Yundong's Yuanyang Qi in her body. When she was in the Zhuji phase, the Yin and Yang Qi were combined, and the heavenly thunder Qi was being tempered and hammered outside. At this time, she had completed the Zhuji phase. In terms of the power of the Niden after the Zhuji phase, she was no less powerful than the Niden that Li Yundong had refined when he had just reached the Zhuji phase. At this time, she chose to subdue the magical item. It was like a newly victorious army taking advantage of the situation to attack a city. Naturally, she would get twice the result with half the effort. In addition, she had been carrying Qiyue and the Vulcan's whip along the way. These two magical items had long been contaminated with Zhou Qin's spiritual qi, so she was quite familiar with them. Not long after, Qiyue let out a clear cry. This magical item, which had once displayed its divine power in Mount Tianlong, finally glowed with a new vitality. With a whoosh, it flew into the sky and excitedly flew around Carry Holy Mountain a few times. Then, it stopped in front of Zhou Qin with a clang. Its whole body emitted a faint silver light, like a silver crescent moon, making a soft buzzing sound of recognizing its master. The Vulcan's whip in Zhou Qin's hand also jumped violently. In an instant, the Vulcan's whip transformed into the shape of a red python. Its whole body was burning with blazing flames, as if a fire snake had crawled out of hell and was spitting out its ferocious and terrifying snake tongue. Zhou Qin shook her wrist, and the fire snake disappeared in an instant. The Vulcan's whip shook and turned into a blazing red light, wrapping Zhou Qin's whole body in it. After the light disappeared, the Vulcan's whip was tightly wrapped around Zhou Qin's slender waist, like a tight belt, making her look heroic and vigorous. Her whole body seemed to have been reborn, and every pore on her body exuded a sharp spirit. Even though they were far away, Zi Yuan could still feel this kind of spirit, which was like a peerless sword, rushing towards her face, as if it could stimulate all the pores on her skin to open up. Zi Yuan was horrified and couldn't help sighing. From now on, there will be one more great cultivator in the cultivation world. Chapter 466. Go to watch net. After Zhou Qin successfully reached the Zhuji phase, she was about to go down the mountain when she saw a llama with a yellow crown and a red robe standing on the top of the mountain. Beside the llama stood a golden feathered eagle that was as tall as a man. The eagle's eyes were sharp, and it was extremely majestic. WatchNet 7 KOM. Zhou Qin took a closer look and saw that this llama was Dorji Tenzin, whom she had met before. She couldn't help but be stunned and said, "Master Dorji Tenzin? Why are you here?" Dorji Tenzin looked at Zhou Qin with awe and complicated eyes. He put his palms together and bowed, saying, "Zhenren Zhou, I am one of the 18 mountain protecting divine monks. There is something wrong with Kari Holy Mountain. Naturally, I should come and have a look." Only then did Zhou Qin understand. She smiled apologetically and said, "I'm really sorry. I'm in the Zhuji phase here. I've disturbed the gods of the Holy Mountain and caused you trouble. I will definitely pay you a visit and apologize in the future." Dorji Tenzin shook his head and said, "No, Zhenren Zhou, I'm not here to cause trouble for you. Don't think too much. I'm here to help Master Erdini bring a few words." Because she had had a conflict with Master Erdini before, she frowned slightly and said, "What do you want to say?" Seeing the hostility in Zhou Qin's expression, Dorji Tenzin was not in a hurry to explain. He just said, "Master Erdini asked me to convey 5 sentences and a question to you. The first sentence is, you are Banda Lam, and Meiduo is not." Even though Zhou Qin had just completed the Zhuji phase and her will was as firm as steel, she was stunned at this time. She widened her eyes and said, What did you say?" "I am the auspicious goddess." "Then, what happened to Meiduo?" Dorji Tenzin sighed softly and said, "This is the second sentence that Master Erdini asked me to tell you. He said that Meiduo's body is just contaminated with your lingqi, so she can turn the Mani wheel." Zhou Qin couldn't help but ask, "But, why did you let Meiduo be this Banda Lam? Why not me?" Dorji Tenzin added, "Master Erdini asked me to tell you the third thing. He said that if he had told you at that time that you were Banda Lam and Meiduo wasn't, would you have gone to Potala Palace?" Zhou Qin shook her head without hesitation. "It's impossible unless I die." Dorji Tenzin smiled, as if he was admiring Master Erdini's foresight. He said with a smile, "Master Erdini's fourth sentence said that Banda Lam is the god of freedom. She would rather die than be restrained, so Master Erdini knows that he can't force you to go to Potala Palace, but he needs someone to be Master Erdini. So he found Meiduo." Zhou Qin couldn't help but say angrily, "Then can you sacrifice Meiduo's freedom and happiness like this? Do you think she's Sangyang Gyatso?" Meiduo's favorite poem was that of the 6th great Lama of Tibet, Sangyang Gyatso, who was a famous sad poet in Tibetan history. He was originally a 15-year-old boy, but later he was recognized by Sangjia Gyatso as a reincarnated spirit child. He forcibly separated Sangyang Gyatso from his lover and brought him to Potala Palace. In the end, Sangyang Gyatso died of depression. Dorji Tenzin smiled and said, "The fifth sentence that Master Erdeni asked me to convey is that the current Banda Lama is not Sangjia Gyatso at that time, and Meiduo is not Sangyang Gyatso. Meiduo is just a temporary Banda Lam. She is a devout Buddhist, and she has such an opportunity to meet the real reincarnated Banda Lam. Therefore, she has the obligation to prevent a great disaster for our esoteric sect. When she completes her mission, she will naturally regain her freedom." Zhou Qin was slightly shocked and asked, "Can Master Erdeni really predict what I want to ask?" Dorji Tenzin laughed and said, "Master Erdeni is one of the few eminent monks in our esoteric sect in recent years with great merit and spiritual power. He can predict a lot of things." Zhou Qin thought for a moment and asked doubtfully, "In that case, can Master Erdeni guess what I want to ask next?" Dorji Tenzin smiled and said, "Master Erdeni also expected it, so he also asked me to convey a question to you. He asked you, does Buddhism have a race?" This question immediately made Zhou Qin feel awe, because it had asked the question in her heart. In Zhou Qin's opinion, she was obviously a Han. Why was she the reincarnation of Banda Lam of the Tibetan esoteric sect? However, Master Erdeni's rhetorical question answered Zhou Qin's doubts. Does Buddhism have a race? Sakyamuni was originally an Indian, but the Buddhism he founded was respected by Buddhists all over the world. The gods and Buddhas in the sky were also different from each other. It was not because of which race believed in which religion, but because the gods of this religion had all evolved from the people of this race. At this time, Zhou Qin finally believed that this Master Erdeni was really a person with great merit and spiritual power. However, there was still a trace of worry in Zhou Qin's heart. She asked again, "When will this great calamity come? Will Meiduo be heard in this great calamity?" Dorji Tenzin put his palms together and said, "Master Erdeni wants me to tell you two things and ask you to convey them to Jinrenli." Zhou Qin was shocked again. "Master Erdeni also knows my master?" Dorji Tenzin smiled and said, "The master knows everything." Zhou Qin asked, "What does the master want me to convey?" Dorji Tenzin said, "The master said that when you go to the snow mountain in the future, you must not go east." Zhou Qin asked in confusion, "What does that mean?" Dorji Tenzin smiled and said, "I don't know. I'm only responsible for conveying it truthfully." Zhou Qin thought for a moment and nodded. "I'll remember it. What about the second sentence?" Dorji Tenzin said, "The master said that Jinrenli has only learned half of the mantra Mahamudra, so it's not the real one." Zhou Qin's expression froze. She knew that Banda Lam was indirectly reminding Li Jiandong. Although she didn't know why the master wanted to help Li Jiandong, she still said with a solemn face, "I see. Does the master have anything else to say?" Dorji Tenzin shook his head with a smile. "No." At this time, Zhou Qin couldn't help laughing. "Master, is there finally something unexpected? In fact, I still have questions to ask." Dorji Tenzin chuckled and said, "Everyone can make mistakes. Jinren Zhou, if you have any questions, just ask them." Zhou Qin asked in confusion, "How can Master Erdeni be sure that I am Banda Lam? I haven't shaken the prayer wheel. Moreover, since he concluded that I was Banda Lam, why was he so fierce when I said that I was going to take Meiduo away?" Dorji Tenzin laughed. He put his palms together and said, "Jinren Zhou, I once asked the master about this out of curiosity. The master said that shaking the Mani wheel is just a cover-up. The living Buddha has never used this method to choose a reincarnated spirit child. He followed your Lingqi all the way here, but when he saw you, he found that you were a Han, and there was a resolute and unyielding temperament between your eyebrows. In addition, he found that Meiduo, who was beside you, also had your Lingqi, so he had to take a step back and let Meiduo replace you. But he didn't expect that you would want to stand up for Meiduo. If our esoteric sect didn't have Banda Lam to help us withstand this disaster, our esoteric sect would have suffered an unimaginable blow. Therefore, he can tolerate you, the real Banda Lam, leaving, but he absolutely can't tolerate Meiduo, the fake Banda Lam, leaving." Only then did Zhou Qin understand. She returned the salute and said, I see. I see. Thank you, Master Erdini, for passing on the message. I thank him on behalf of my master. Dorji Tenzin smiled slightly. He patted the big eagle, who was waiting impatiently beside him, and said, Dammer is a little impatient. My words have also been passed on. Jinren Zhou, see you later. Zhou Qin smiled and nodded to Dorji Tenzin. Then, she looked at Dorji Tenzin and whistled loudly. She jumped down the cliff. Dorji Tenzin moved. The golden-feathered eagle spread its wings and glided down like a bomber, accurately catching Dorji Tenzin's body. After the golden-feathered eagle spread its wings, the length of its wings was an astonishing 5 meters. Although there was a burly adult man sitting on it, the eagle still let out a very relaxed cry, spread its wings, and disappeared into the horizon. After Zhou Qin watched Dorji Tenzin leave, she looked at the majestic eagle with some envy and thought to herself, it would be great if I had such a big eagle. It would save me a lot of effort wherever I go. Zhou Qin looked down at the foot of the iceberg, which was like a cliff, and said with a wry smile, It's easy to go up the mountain, but difficult to go down. Although I have succeeded in the Zhuji phase, I can't fly. How can I go down? Just as she was worrying, she heard a familiar voice say with a smile, Do you need a ride? Jinren Zhou? Zhou Qin turned her head and saw Zi Yuan and Wan Hongling standing not far away, looking at her with a smile. Zhou Qin was immediately overjoyed. Zi Yuan, Wan Hongling? Why are you here? Wan Hongling said with a smile, We escorted you all the way from the Zhuji phase to here. Why do you think we are here? Zhou Qin was stunned. Have you been following me? Zi Yuan smiled slightly and said softly, Yes, Li Jiandong was afraid that something would happen to you on the way, so he asked us to protect you all the way. But because we are afraid of affecting your Zhuji phase, as long as you are not maliciously murdered by cultivators, we will not show up. Please forgive us, Jinren Zhou. Zhou Qin was moved when she heard this, and a gentle smile appeared on her resolute and handsome face. Master is so worried about me. Zi Yuan smiled and said, We have been out for almost a month. It's time to go back. Tomorrow is the Taoist assembly. Jinren Zhou, are you ready to show your skills at the Taoist assembly? Zhou Qin formed a palm with one hand, bowed with a smile, and said, Of course. I'm afraid that I will embarrass Master. Zi Yuan smiled and was about to speak when Wan Hongling couldn't help urging, Let's go back and talk. It's really inappropriate to chat on this iceberg, which is dozens of degrees below zero. The 3 beautiful women looked at each other and laughed in unison. Zi Yuan walked to Zhou Qin's side, put her hand on her wrist with a smile, and said, Jinren Zhou, are you ready to go down the mountain? This sentence had a double meaning. Zhou Qin stood on the Kari holy mountain and looked down at the vast earth. She had never dreamed that, as the daughter of an official family, she would one day be able to stand on such a high ground and look down at the common people. At this moment, Zhou Qin felt an unprecedentedly powerful force flowing in her body. She shouted with great pride, Go down the mountain. Vote recommendation previous page return to table of contents next page error report if you like. Please click here to add, Raising a Fox at Home, to your bookshelf, so that you can read the latest chapters and updates of Raising a Fox at Home, in the future. If you have any suggestions or comments on Raising a Fox at Home, please click here to express your personal views. Chapter 467. Go to Watch Network. Just as all the heroes were gearing up for the Taoist assembly, in Li Yundong's home, Buddhist scriptures were being chanted and smoke was curling up. Many people living in the Riverside district could hear the almost continuous chanting of Buddha when they passed by Li Yundong's house. Sometimes the chanting was the voice of a group of young women, and sometimes it was the voice of a young woman. But without exception, these voices were very pleasant to listen to. Even the chanting of Buddhist scriptures made people involuntarily stop in their tracks and look at Li Yundong's house. Although Li Yundong lived in seclusion with all the members of the Fox Zen school, and Zi Yuan and the others were also very low-key, he, a handsome boy, living with a group of beautiful women, was naturally something that people would talk about. Even if there was nothing wrong, they would still talk about it. His identity and the identity of these beautiful women, as well as the relationship between him and these beautiful women, were one of the most popular topics in the community. Among this group of people, 2 women with quite extraordinary temperaments were coldly watching these people pointing at Li Yundong's house. One of the women whispered to a beautiful woman beside her, "Shiji Zhou Ping, everyone went to the Taoist assembly today. What are we doing here?" Zhou Ping's attire today was not much different from that of any girl who loved beauty. She was wearing a dark gray windbreaker, which showed off her slender figure. There was a sword hidden in her windbreaker, and her curly hair was coiled behind her head, covering the hilt of the sword that was exposed from the back of her collar with her black hair, which was like a dark cloud falling down. Zhou Ping said with a faint expression, "This is Master's order." Master heard that Li Yundong had borrowed the burning thumb pot from Master Purin, so he asked me to see if he had subdued it. Now it seems that this guy must have failed to subdue the burning thumb pot, and his entire divine sense and soul have been pulled into the burning thumb pot. Although Zhou Ping's Shiji was not as good-looking as Zhou Ping, she looked extremely young, like she was only 15 or 16 years old. Moreover, she had a small oval face, which was quite pleasing to the eye. She asked curiously, "Burning thumb pot? Is it Fahai's burning thumb pot?" Zhou Ping looked at her shimmy with a complicated gaze and said, "Yes." The junior sister laughed, revealing 2 small canine teeth. "Hee, then this Li Yundong is going to suffer a setback. This burning thumb pot is not an ordinary magical item. The process of subduing it is no less difficult than building one's foundation again." Zhou Ping snorted coldly and said, "Although this madman's cultivation quotient is high, he has only been cultivating for a short time after all. He's a real nouveau riche. In addition, he's greedy, lustful, and has evil intentions. It would be strange if he didn't fall for the burning thumb pot. Master really thinks highly of him, to actually let me pay special attention to him." "Humph." The junior sister giggled and said, "It took Master Haidang 30 days to subdue the burning thumb pot. No matter how powerful he is, I'm afraid he won't be able to get out within 30 days. It seems that this guy won't make it to the Taoist assembly." Zhou Ping sneered and said, "It's best if he doesn't make it. I don't want to see his face. I hate it." The junior sister smiled and said, "That's not good. I specially asked Master to let me go down the mountain just to see the kung fu skills of Li Yundong, who is known as the #1 master of the younger generation in the cultivation world. If he doesn't come, why would I come to watch the Taoist assembly?" Zhou Ping snorted and said, "It's useless even if he comes. There are many masters in this year's Taoist assembly, and the strong people of all sects are eager to win. If he comes, he'll just be a laughing stock and add to the humiliation." The junior sister said with some disappointment, "Is this guy so useless?" Zhou Ping said earnestly, "Junior sister, you think too highly of him. In the past, when Li Yundong fought with others, he relied on his strength to defeat 10 people. That's why he won by luck. Even if he has real ability, compared to the cultivators of our orthodox Xian men who have been cultivating for more than 10 years, he is still far from it. The Taoist assembly is about the magical use of magic, not about whose Jinqi is more powerful or whose strength is greater. There are thousands of Taoist magic, but the most important thing is magic, not strength." The junior sister nodded and said, "Senior sister Zhou Ping, I see. Thank you for your advice. Let's go." Zhou Ping nodded and said, "Let's go. Don't waste time here." Just as they were about to leave, they suddenly heard a commotion coming from not far away. Zhou Ping and the junior sister turned their heads and saw 3 women dressed in different clothes coming from afar. One of the 3 women was dressed in a student's uniform. She was extremely beautiful, and her eyebrows were like ink paintings. Her black hair was tied up in a ponytail, revealing her full and bright forehead. She looked confident and proud. It was Ruan Hongling. Next to her was a woman dressed in white. Her hair cascaded down her shoulders like a waterfall. Every strand of her hair was soft and straight. Just by looking at her back, one would feel that every movement of this woman's hands and feet exuded an ethereal aura. It was truly like walking on the waves with delicate steps and walking on the ground. As soon as Zhou Ping saw the two women, she immediately gritted her teeth and sneered, "It's these two bitches again." The junior sister looked at Zi Yuan and Wan Hongling curiously. She asked in a low voice, "Is this Zi Yuan, who used to be known as the top master of the younger generation? She's so beautiful." Zhou Ping sneered and said, "Look at her. She looks beautiful and dignified, but in fact, she is a prostitute who has abandoned herself. Otherwise, why would she hang out with a bunch of fox spirits all day long? I feel ashamed for her." The junior sister saw that there was no trace of evil in Zi Yuan's body, let alone any obscene aura. In particular, there was an elegant and refined aura between her eyebrows, and her eyes were as clear as spring water in a mountain stream, without a trace of the mortal world. She couldn't help but say, how could such a woman be so unbearable? "Shiji, are you sure you're not mistaken?" Zhou Ping was furious. She frowned and shouted in a low voice, "B*****, what do you mean by that? Don't think that just because you're the daughter of third Shibua, I won't dare to teach you a lesson." Seeing that Zhou Ping was angry, the junior sister quickly smiled apologetically and changed the topic. She pointed to the woman next to her and said, "Who is this woman? I've never seen a female cultivator who's so energetic." Zhou Ping snorted angrily and looked over. She saw a valiant woman standing next to Zi Yuan. This woman was extremely beautiful. Her eyebrows were like sharp swords, and her black eyes were like stars. Her eyes were shining brightly, and when she moved, she looked around with an indescribable sense of coldness and disdain. Zhou Ping was shocked. She couldn't help but whisper, "Is this Zhou Qin? Has she reached the Zhuji phase?" The junior sister asked curiously, "Zhou Qin? Who is she? She seems very powerful." Zhou Ping sneered and said disdainfully, "How powerful can someone who has just reached the Zhuji phase be? Humph, let's go." The junior sister blinked her eyes and looked at Zhou Qin, muttering to herself, "I wonder if Zhou Qin will participate in the Taoist assembly. If she does, I'll have to see how good her kung fu is." The two of them turned to leave. Before they left, Zhou Ping couldn't help looking back at Zhou Qin again. She was a little shocked in her heart. The ancients say that a scholar who has been away for 3 days will be looked at with new eyes. I didn't expect that Zhou Qin would have made such great progress after not seeing her for a few days. It's really scary. No, I have to tell Master immediately. Otherwise, if she grows up, our Zhengyi school will have another big enemy. Zi Yuan, Zhou Qin, and Wan Hongling walked under the gazes of everyone along the way. Wan Hongling saw where they lived at first glance and couldn't help laughing. "Amitba, we're finally home. We've finally ended the days of not having a hot bath and watching TV." Zi Yuan scolded her with a smile, "Are you still a cultivator? Are you so greedy for enjoyment?" Wan Hongling made a face and said, "You can't say that. Sister Zi Yuan, don't you want to take a comfortable hot bath?" Zi Yuan glanced at Wan Hongling, but before she could speak, Zhou Qin couldn't help laughing. "Don't argue. I don't know if Zhenren Zi Yuan wants to or not. Anyway, I can't wait. I've lived for so many days, but I've never not taken a hot bath for so many days. I usually wash in lakes and rivers secretly, but it's not comfortable. It's so uncomfortable." After she finished speaking, Wan Hongling couldn't help clapping her hands and laughing. Zi Yuan also couldn't help smiling. The three of them walked downstairs, talking and laughing. Suddenly, they heard the sound of chanting in the house. Zi Yuan couldn't help but be stunned. Is this the Great Compassion Mantra? Who's chanting? Zhou Qin couldn't help laughing. It seems to be Su Chan's voice. Maybe she's doing something strange again. Ruan Hongling was an impatient person, so she immediately rushed to open the door with the key. As soon as she opened the door, she was shocked. The room was filled with smoke and there was a strong smell of sandalwood everywhere. Su Chan was kneeling in front of a Guanyin shrine, her palms together, and chanting Buddhist scriptures devoutly. Ruan Hongling said in surprise, "Su Chan, what are you doing? When did you become a Buddhist?" Hearing the voice, Su Chan looked back. After more than 10 days of fear, she suddenly had a place to cry. She couldn't help but shed tears and sobbed, "Sister Zi Yuan, Sister Zhou Qin, Hongling, Yundong, Yundong." Zhou Qin's heart suddenly skipped a beat, and her face changed drastically. She couldn't help stepping forward and grabbing Su Chan's arm. She asked in a trembling voice, "What's wrong with Master?" Zi Yuan's body also trembled slightly. She asked in a trembling voice, "What's wrong with Li Yundong?" Su Chan said with tears in her eyes, "Yundong has subdued the burning thumb pot and hasn't woken up yet. This is already the 18th day. What?" Zi Yuan and Ruan Hongling were shocked. Zi Yuan couldn't help stamping her feet and saying, "Alas, it's all my fault for leaving in such a hurry that I didn't tell him. This burning thumb pot is a powerful magical weapon of the eminent monks of past generations. It's extremely difficult to subdue. If his mind is slightly impure, he will fall into the tracheochasm and be unable to extricate himself. Damn it, damn it." Zhou Qin had successfully reached the Zhuji phase and returned. She had originally wanted to give Li Yundong a surprise, but she had never expected that she would encounter such bad news after returning. Her face was as white as a sheet as she said, "What should we do now?" Zi Yuan took a deep breath and calmed down slightly. She said in a deep voice, "Don't worry, take me to see him." Su Chan wiped her tears and took Zi Yuan, Zhou Qin, and Ruan Hongling to Li Yundong's room. Zi Yuan pushed open the door and saw Li Yundong sitting cross-legged on the futon like a stone statue. In his palm was the burning thumb pot with brilliant colors. His expression was normal and he was motionless. If Su Chan hadn't told her that Li Yundong had not woken up for 18 days, Zi Yuan would have thought that Li Yundong had just entered meditation. Zi Yuan moved closer to Li Yundong and looked at his condition for a while. Then she turned to Su Chan and said, "Go get the golden needles." Su Chan had been looking at Zi Yuan eagerly, hoping that she would have a solution. At this time, seeing that Zi Yuan had an order, she immediately sighed and quickly went to the room to get the golden needles. At this time, the little foxes in each room also heard the noise and knew that Zhou Qin had returned from the Zhuji phase. They all came out of their rooms to say hello to Zhou Qin, then crowded together and looked at Li Yundong with concern. They all wanted to know how Zi Yuan was going to wake him up. Vote recommendation previous page next page error report if you like. Please click here to add Keeping a Fox at Home to your bookshelf, so that you can read the latest chapters and updates of Keeping a Fox at Home in the future. If you have any suggestions or comments on Keeping a Fox at Home, please click here to express your views. Chapter 468. Go to WatchNet. After a while, Su Chan came over with a small cloth bag and handed it to Zi Yuan. Zi Yuan opened it, took out a 3-inch long golden needle, and pierced it into Li Yundong's Lingtai acupoint. Go to WatchNet. Li Yundong's body trembled slightly, and then Zi Yuan pierced another needle into Li Yundong's Shinting acupoint. Su Chan watched Zi Yuan's movements nervously. She had followed Ao Wushuang for a long time and knew some medical skills. She knew that Zi Yuan's 2 needles were all important acupoints of the human body. If there was a slight deviation in the needle, it would be life-threatening. Then, Su Chan saw that Zi Yuan was piercing the Baihui acupoint on the top of Li Yundong's head again, and she suddenly cried out in shock. The Baihui acupoint was one of the fatal acupoints of the human body. Zi Yuan's needle scared Su Chan so much that her legs became a little weak. Su Chan looked at the shining golden needle on the Baihui acupoint on the top of Li Yundong's head with a pale face. She couldn't help thinking in fear, Sister Zi Yuan, why are you piercing the Baihui acupoint? If you don't do it well, you'll die. Zi Yuan turned her head to look at Su Chan and explained in a low voice, Su Chan, don't worry. Now Li Yundong's divine sense is trapped in the burning thumb pot, and the burning thumb pot is now connected to Li Yundong's Shenqi. If you want Li Yundong to wake up, you have to sneak into his body with your own Yin spirit, and then follow his aura into the burning thumb pot. But now Li Yundong's whole body is in a closed state. The Jinshi in his body has been connected to the burning thumb pot, like a self-circulating small universe. It's extremely difficult for things from the outside world to enter. If you want to force your way in, it will only cause Li Yundong's spirit space to collapse, and from then on, he will become a useless person without divine sense. I pierced Li Yundong's Shenting, Lingtai, and Baihui acupoints to break his flawless leakless body. I wanted to create a gap in his leakless body so that my Yin spirit could sneak into his body. After hearing Zi Yuan's explanation, Su Chan suddenly understood. She glanced at Zi Yuan and asked in a low voice, Sister Zi Yuan, can I go in? Zi Yuan shook her head and looked at Su Chan helplessly. Su Chan, you're not a yang spirit body. You can't go in. Su Chan's face was full of disappointment. She suddenly thought to herself, once upon a time, I was the most powerful person around Li Yundong, but now Zi Yuan's cultivation is far above mine. Zhou Qin, who didn't know any cultivation before, has reached the Zhuji phase. Her Zhenqi is far more powerful than mine. Even Wan Hongling's cultivation is higher than mine. The little girl looked at Zi Yuan, then at Zhou Qin, and then at Wan Hongling. There was a flash of sadness in her eyes. She couldn't help but secretly regret that she had only cared about playing with Li Yundong in the past, but had refused to work hard to cultivate. Now, she had become the one with the lowest cultivation. Thinking of this, Su Chan couldn't help but secretly make up her mind. Even if I can't compare to Sister Zi Yuan, I can't let Zhou Qin catch up and surpass me. I'm not a fool. If I really work hard, can't I be better than others? At this time, Zhou Qin and the others were looking at Zi Yuan and Li Yundong with concern. No one noticed the little girl's thoughts. They saw that after Zi Yuan's 3 golden needles pierced Li Yundong's body, 3 extremely faint white threads slowly emerged from the Baihui acupoints on the top of his head, the Shenting acupoints on his forehead, and the Lingtai acupoints on his back. These 3 threads rose straight up and floated straight to the ceiling before spreading out on their own. Zi Yuan sat cross-legged in front of Li Yundong. After a while, she entered a meditative state and the yang spirit went out of her body. After Zi Yuan's yang spirit went out of her body, she said to Zhou Qin and the others with a serious expression, if I don't come out within 15 minutes, prepare for the funeral of Li Yundong and me. Don't think about saving him, and don't think about saving me. Zhou Qin and the others were shocked and they heard this, and they all got goosebumps at the same time. But before they could dissuade her, Zi Yuan's figure flashed, and the yang spirit quickly rushed toward Li Yundong. When Zi Yuan's yang spirit was about to touch Li Yundong's body, it instantly turned into a Yin spirit and turned into countless cyan light spots, drilling into Li Yundong's broken Baihui acupoints, Lingtai acupoints, and Shenting acupoints. At this time, the yang spirit in Li Yundong's body had been drawn into the spirit space of the burning thumb pot, so Li Yundong's body was equivalent to an ownerless house at this time. After Zi Yuan came in, she did not encounter any resistance. Zi Yuan felt that there seemed to be a great pulling force in Li Yundong's body, constantly pulling her divine sense, like a whirlpool constantly devouring all the conscious lives around her. Zi Yuan did not resist and quickly followed the qi in Li Yundong's body toward the burning thumb pot. Not long after, she suddenly felt that the dark and boundless world around her suddenly lit up, and she instantly came to a huge and empty world. In this world stood a strangely shaped mountain. Zi Yuan, who was proficient in Buddhist scriptures, knew that this was Mount Meru. Zi Yuan did not stop at all. She quickly flew to the mountainside of Mount Meru. She took a closer look and saw that the figures of Li Yundong and Su Chan were everywhere in the 3,000 worlds around Mount Meru, but Ziyuan did not know which world Li Yundong's real body was in. Ziyuan took a deep breath. She knew that 10 years in this spirit space was only equivalent to 1 minute in the outside world, so she patiently searched one world after another. However, there were billions of mortals in the 3,000 worlds. How could it be so easy to find Li Yundong's real body? Ziyuan's figure was busy shuttling from one spirit space to another. She did this repeatedly for an unknown amount of time. She didn't even know how many spirit spaces she had gone to, nor did she know how many years she had spent here. She only knew that every time she reached a spirit space, she would pinch a mark on her sleeve with her nails. This repeated for many years. When Ziyuan finally felt a trace of exhaustion and despair, she found that her sleeves were already densely covered with fingernail marks. In some places, her clothes were a little torn because she had pinched them repeatedly. Is it really impossible to find him? Ziyuan thought in despair as she stood in the vast world of mortals. But if she couldn't find Li Yundong's whereabouts, wouldn't everything she had done before be in vain? Then wouldn't her master's psalm be? Thinking of this, Ziyuan couldn't help but look confused. This woman, who was usually very assertive, couldn't help but be a little absent-minded. She left a spirit space out of habit and then entered another spirit space in a daze. Ziyuan, who had searched more than 2,000 spirit spaces in succession, had found nothing. At this time, she was already discouraged. Just as she was thinking about the psalm left by her master, she suddenly found herself in a spirit space with a sea of clouds. In this spirit space, there was an endless sea of clouds everywhere. Above this sea of clouds, there was only one mountain. On the mountain was a lush green pine tree. Under the tallest and largest pine tree, which was like a giant umbrella, sat a white-haired old man. The vast sea of clouds in front of Ziyuan was so magnificent and beautiful that when she took a look at it, her heart opened up and her previous depression disappeared. Ziyuan cheered up and flew to the old man under the pine tree. Just as she was about to speak, she saw that the old man was silently staring at the two people who were bending over and busy in a green terraced field not far from the top of the mountain. Ziyuan followed his gaze curiously and saw Li Yundong and Su Chan at the foot of the mountain. They were dressed like farmers and were busy sowing seeds. Although the two of them were working hard, they laughed and played from time to time, getting their bodies covered with mud. However, their laughter was full of joy. Even from a distance, Ziyuan could hear Su Chan's bell-like laughter and Li Yundong's cheerful and loud laughter. A warm air blew over her face. Ziyuan shuttled back and forth between the 3,000 worlds. No matter where she went, Li Yundong and Su Chan lived happily together. She had seen such scenes many times. Ziyuan turned her face and asked the old man in a clear voice, "Old man, have you ever seen?" Before she could finish her words, the old man's body shook. He suddenly raised his head and said in surprise, "Ziyuan?" Although the voice was old, it was the first time that Ziyuan had met someone who could recognize her in this spirit space. She suddenly widened her eyes and carefully looked at the white-haired old man in front of her. She saw that although the old man's hair was so long that it almost reached the ground and his beard was so long that it almost covered his face, Ziyuan could still vaguely see a trace of familiarity between the old man's eyebrows. She asked tentatively, "Li Yundong?" Li Yundong suddenly stood up and shook off a lot of dust from his body. He stared at Ziyuan with his eyes wide open and said, "Why are you here?" After traveling through more than 2,000 spirit spaces and spending decades, Ziyuan finally found Li Yundong's whereabouts. Even though she was calm, she couldn't help but be overjoyed. She grabbed Li Yundong's hands and said loudly, "Thank God, I finally found you." Li Yundong was stunned. "Are you looking for me?" Ziyuan nodded with a smile on her face and said, "Yes, your divine sense has been tied up in the spirit space of the burning thumb pot for 18 days. I came here specially to find you." Li Yundong exclaimed. His eyes were filled with vicissitudes of life and he said with a sigh, I remember. I seem to have been here for many, many years. Zi Yuan had finally found Li Yundong after a lot of hardships. She couldn't help but laugh and say, 10 years in the spirit space is equivalent to 1 minute outside. I'm afraid you have been in the spirit space for tens of thousands of years, haven't you? No matter which spirit space you are in, you must be tired of it, right? Is it time to go back now? Li Yundong took a deep look at Zi Yuan. He smiled slightly, shook his head, and then slowly sat down. He flicked his sleeves and said lightly, Zi Yuan, you go back. I won't go back. Zi Yuan was shocked and immediately asked, why? Chapter 469. Go to watch net. Li Yundong sat cross-legged under the pine tree, silently watching his other self and Su Chan, who were working in the countryside. His face was full of a quiet and serene smile, as if as long as he looked at them from afar, he would feel satisfied and happy. Go to watch net. 7 K.O.M. Li Yundong asked slowly, Zi Yuan, why do you cultivate? Zi Yuan hadn't expected that Li Yundong would ask her a question. She thought for a moment and said, to transcend the sufferings of the world and ascend to the immortal realm. Li Yundong smiled slightly and said, yes, it's very in line with your cultivation standards. When I first saw you, I thought, how could there be such a beautiful woman in this world? Could it be that you are a fairy descending to the world? At that time, I thought that you were a fairy who would ascend to the immortal realm sooner or later, so for you, cultivation is to seek immortality. Zi Yuan listened quietly to Li Yundong's words. Although the old Li Yundong in front of her was no longer as handsome as before, his hoarse and old voice revealed a strong and dignified sense of vicissitudes. Li Yundong looked at Su Chan in the spirit space with gentle eyes and said softly, but have you ever thought that even if you become an immortal, what can you do? Is it because there is no birth, aging, illness, and death, and you feel happy because you have jumped out of the cycle of life and death? Or, do you just want to follow in your master's footsteps and go to the immortal realm to find him? Zi Yuan's subconscious, which had been hidden in the bottom of her heart for a long time, was pointed out by Li Yundong. Her body stiffened slightly, and she couldn't help saying in her mind, yes, I follow in master's footsteps and even regard his psalm as my golden rule. Why? Is it just because I want to stay by master's side and be with him? But. Master loves Ao Wushuang, not me. Zi Yuan had been by her master's side since she was a child. In her impression, her master was omnipotent. Not only was he the most beautiful man in the world, but he was also the most handsome man in the world. He was also the most amazing man. Because of this, Zi Yuan's life was deeply imprinted with Wang Yuanshan's mark, and these marks were everywhere. Thinking about her past, she vaguely felt that her master, Wang Yuanshan, seemed to have noticed her feelings, so he left a psalm and told her that Li Yundong in front of her was her lover. It was because of his master's psalm that he had come to this spirit space without hesitation. But even if the Li Yundong in front of her was really her lover, he loved Su Chan, not her. He cultivated in order to ascend to the immortal realm, to find his master, but to ascend to the immortal realm, he had to save his lover. At the end of the day, he had cultivated for the sake of love. However, neither her master nor her lover loved her. Then what was the purpose of her cultivation? This question made Zi Yuan feel as if she had fallen into the mortal world of the three realms. She was obsessed, possessed, and bewildered. She stood there without saying a word, and her expression kept changing. At this time, Li Yundong's eyes seemed to have seen through the mortal world. He smiled slightly and said, Zi Yuan, you cultivated in order to ascend to the immortal realm. But do you know why I cultivated? At this time, Zi Yuan was in a daze. She could only hear Li Yundong's words, but her mind was in a mess. Seeing that Zi Yuan didn't speak, Li Yundong didn't look back. He continued to say, the purpose of my cultivation was very simple. It was to protect Su Chan from being bullied, and then to protect myself from being bullied. She and I could live happily. Li Yundong pointed to himself and Su Chan at the foot of the mountain. He said with a smile, "Look, how happy they are now. I have traveled all over the 3,000 spirit spaces to find my true self in the billions of mortal worlds. During this period, I have experienced countless life and death separations and encountered countless strong enemies, just to protect myself and Su Chan in this spirit space from being separated and from being bullied. When I came to this spirit space, I found that there was no one else in this world, only me and Su Chan. Therefore, I chose to stay and sit quietly on the sea of clouds, looking at them. I wanted to see if they would feel tired of this simple life, and if their feelings would fade little by little as they grew older." Li Yundong smiled with emotion. "But as a bystander, I watched myself slowly grow old, but they were still happy. You see, didn't I cultivate to see myself and my lover get married? Now that they are living a simple and happy life, what else do I have to think about?" Hearing this, Zi Yuan felt melancholy in her heart. She sighed softly and said, "But the you down there is not you." Li Yundong turned around and asked with a smile, "What's the difference?" Zi Yuan opened her mouth and wanted to refute, but when she looked at Li Yundong's bottomless black eyes, she couldn't say anything for a moment. She sighed softly and simply sat down cross-legged beside Li Yundong. She said, "In that case, I won't go out. I'll stay with you." Li Yundong was slightly stunned. "You won't go out? How can that be?" Zi Yuan smiled rather sadly. "Why can't it work? What's the difference between staying here and going out? Anyway, whether it's my master or..." At this point, Zi Yuan swallowed the rest of her words, and a blush appeared on her beautiful face. Li Yundong said seriously, "No, if you can't get out, what do you want Wan Hongling to do? What about the Linggong sect that your master left for you? Do you want to leave Wan Hongling behind and let the other disciples of the Jingyi school bully your little shimmy?" Zi Yuan's heart skipped a beat. She took over Li Yundong's words and asked, "You're right, but have you ever thought that if you stay here, you will be satisfied to see yourself and Su Chan in this spirit space? But have you ever thought about what Su Chan, who is waiting for you to go back and fulfill your promise, will do outside this spirit space?" When Li Yundong heard this, his body suddenly shook, and his eyes suddenly widened. Seeing this, Zi Yuan immediately struck while the iron was hot and said, "Even if you think that there is no difference between the Su Chan outside and the Su Chan in front of you, have you ever thought about other people? What about Zhou Qin? She just came back from the Zhuji phase. Do you know that? You led her on the path of cultivation, and then you want to abandon her and leave her alone? My master left me and Hongling behind. You can't do this." Zi Yuan spoke of the sadness and desolation in her heart. Every word was sincere, and every sentence came from the bottom of her heart, which immediately moved Li Yundong. Zi Yuan continued, "Apart from Su Chan and Zhou Qin, what about those little foxes who have a strong dependence on you? You took them down the mountain, and you don't care about them? Do you know what will happen to them if you don't care about them? Since ancient times, all the foxes who went down the mountain and entered the world ended up in a miserable state. Aren't you harming them by doing this? Can you face your conscience by doing this? Can you live here with peace of mind?" When Li Yundong heard this, his expression changed, and he stared at Zi Yuan blankly. After a long time, he finally couldn't help it. He let out a long breath, stood up, flicked his sleeves, and let out a loud laugh. He said in a clear voice, "Buddha, I think I know what my true self is." In this vast world of clouds, a Buddha's name suddenly came. The clouds quickly gathered together and turned into a huge statue of Buddha. The Buddha said majestically, "Amitabha, then what is the true self?" Li Yundong's expression was full of enlightenment and clarity. He said in a sonorous voice, "Ordinary people cling to the 5 skandhas and pretend to be themselves. In fact, that is a false self. If you have the 8 great freedom like Buddha, then you will be the true self." The statue of Buddha in the sea of clouds asked in a booming voice, "Then what are the 8 great freedom?" Li Yundong said in a clear voice, the 8 great free selves are divided into, first, being able to show one body as many as one body means that one can be small and can change oneself to be as small as a speck of dust. Second, being able to show one's body as big as the boundless world means that one can be big and can change oneself to be as big as the infinite void world. Third, being able to lift one's body far away means that one can change oneself to be as light as a feather. Fourth, being able to live in the infinite world means that one can be free and change one's size at will. Fifth, being able to use all the roots means that you can have a master and freely change into a big person or a small person. Your heart has no superiority or inferiority, and you can subdue and accept everything. Sixth, being able to get all the Dharma means that you can go far away, which means that you can go anywhere you want. Seventh, saying Agatha, going through infinite tribulations means that you can move, which means that you can make the earth tremble 6 or 18 times. Eighth, being everywhere, like the void, means that you can make one body as many as you want, and many as you want. You can go straight through the mountain wall, walk on water and fire, walk in the void, turn the 4 directions, turn the earth into water, and turn stone into gold, all at your will. Li Yundong spoke with confidence and assurance. Zi Yuan was slightly shocked when she heard this. She thought to herself, when did Li Yundong study the Dharma so thoroughly? He's amazing. Unexpectedly, Li Yundong seemed to have heard what she was thinking. He turned around and said with a smile, "How do you think I spent my time in the Trichiliacosm? I don't know how many years I've stayed in the Trichiliacosm. I've read almost all the books that can be hidden in the Trichiliacosm and learned almost all the magic that can be read. It's because I've experienced too much in the Trichiliacosm that I'm finally tired. I don't want to leave after staying in this quiet spirit space. If you hadn't come to find me and wake me up, I'm afraid I would have stayed here forever." When Zi Yuan saw that Li Yundong's voice and expression had returned to their previous state, she couldn't help but feel happy. She smiled and was about to reply when she heard the Buddha statue in the sea of clouds say, "Since you know the 8 great beings, why don't you show them to me?" Li Yundong raised his eyebrows and said, "What's so difficult about that?" After that, Li Yundong shook his sleeves and shouted, "Small." In the blink of an eye, Li Yundong's figure disappeared in the air. He said, "I exist in every tiny particle of dust in this spirit space." As expected, Zi Yuan heard countless sounds of Li Yundong coming from all directions at the same time. It was as if countless water droplets had gathered into stormy waves and poured into her ears. Even with her high cultivation, she couldn't help but frown and cover her ears. Soon, Li Yundong's figure appeared and he shouted again, "Big." His figure suddenly grew bigger. Zi Yuan, who was standing to one side, looked up, but she couldn't even see where his knees were. Compared with Li Yundong, the towering Buddha statue in the sea of clouds suddenly became a tiny speck of dust. Li Yundong quickly returned to his original state and said, "Light." Then, his figure floated up lightly. Li Yundong smiled and said to Zi Yuan, "Blow on me." Zi Yuan curiously blew a mouthful of fragrance at Li Yundong, only to see him floating far away like a feather. Li Yundong laughed and shouted, "It can grow." He stretched out his arm, and one of his arms suddenly became extremely long, as if it could stretch across the sky. Soon, he shouted again, "It can be short." The other arm suddenly became extremely short, as if it was missing an arm. Li Yundong quickly displayed the free transformation technique one by one. From an old man to a child, he could change anything with his mind. When Li Yundong showed the 7th free self, he shouted, "It can move." He turned his hands over, as if Buddha had turned over the 5 Fingers Mountain. The spirit space in the sea of clouds suddenly shook violently, and the top of the mountain seemed to be shaking to the point that it would collapse at any time. Su Chan and Li Yundong, who were in the spirit space, hugged each other in panic and cried out loudly. Zi Yuan was also a little shaken by the shaking of the sky and earth. She had to fly up and shout, "Don't shake it. If it continues, the spirit space will collapse. Even if the spirit space doesn't collapse, the mountain will." Li Yundong laughed and said, if the mountain turns into a piece of gold, how can it collapse? After that, Li Yundong pointed his finger at the mountain peak. In the blink of an eye, the whole mountain turned into a shining golden mountain, and the shaking between heaven and earth suddenly stopped. As a famous person in the cultivation world, although she was experienced and knowledgeable, she couldn't help but be stunned and dazzled by Li Yundong's magical skills. At this time, Li Yundong said to the Cloud Sea Buddha statue in a clear voice, how is it? Are the 8 free selves the true selves? The Cloud Sea Buddha statue laughed and said, not bad, not bad. You have traveled through the trichiliocosm and have indeed learned the magic of the 8 free selves. Amazing, it deserves to be the Dharmakaya of the reincarnation of the immovable Wisdom King. Now, I can rest assured that I will hand over the burning thumb pot to you. With your experience this time and the power of the Dharmakaya of the reincarnation of the immovable Wisdom King, from now on, you can use all the magical items of Buddhism at will without any obstacles. Ha 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 ha. Chapter 470. Go to watch net. After the Cloud Sea Buddha statue laughed loudly, its body suddenly turned into countless clouds and went in all directions. Go to watch net. In the blink of an eye, the mini kiliocosm buzzed and trembled, as if it would collapse at any time. A whirlpool appeared in the sky above the mini kiliocosm. The clouds and everything else in the mini kiliocosm kept flying towards this whirlpool. Li Yundong put his hands behind his back and said to Zi Yuan with a smile, the spirit space is about to collapse. Zi Yuan, you should leave first. Zi Yuan also knew that the spirit space was about to collapse. If she didn't escape before it collapsed, her young spirit would be completely left in the burning thumb pot, and she wouldn't be able to get out even if she wanted to in the future. She glanced at Li Yundong and couldn't help saying, what about you? Are you still not leaving? Li Yundong wiped his face with his hand. In the blink of an eye, he had changed from an old man with a long beard to the handsome young Li Yundong from before. He laughed and said, don't worry, I still have to go out and fulfill my promise to Su Chan. Only then did Zi Yuan feel relieved. She quickly flew toward the whirlpool in the sky above her head. The moment she flew into the whirlpool, she couldn't help but stop and look back at Li Yundong. She saw that the man's figure was calm and composed in the world that was about to collapse. His expression seemed to have seen through everything, grasped everything, and controlled everything. Even if the world were to be destroyed in the next second, he would have the ability to turn the tide. At this moment, Zi Yuan couldn't help but compare the figure of Wang Yuanshan in the depths of her memory with the figure of the man in front of her, who had finally shed his immaturity and began to show the bearing of a great cultivator. In front of Zi Yuan's eyes, the two figures gradually overlapped, and it was no longer possible to distinguish them from each other, and there was no difference between them. At this moment, Zi Yuan's heart skipped a beat. She didn't dare to look at him anymore, for fear that if she looked at him again, she would be reluctant to leave like Li Yundong before. Li Yundong, remember, Su Chan is waiting for you. Zi Yuan shouted one last time. She closed her eyes, turned around, and flew into the whirlpool. He looked at himself and Su Chan in the spirit space, hugging each other tightly and leaning against each other. In the end, the two of them, like the countless clouds in the spirit space, flew into the whirlpool and disappeared. He sighed softly and said, it's time to wake up from the dream. My Chaner is waiting for me to go back. These fake me will disappear, but Chan and I will never disappear. She and I will be together forever. As soon as Zi Yuan returned from the spirit space of the burning thumb pot, thousands of yang spirit divine senses finally escaped from the 3 Lingtai, Bai Hui, and Shinting acupoints of Li Yunyang that had been opened. Her yang spirit instantly gathered together and returned to her body. As soon as she opened her eyes, she heard Su Chan and the little foxes cheering ecstatically. A little fox shouted excitedly, 14 minutes and 59 seconds. It was so close, so close. Although Zhou Qin had experienced countless dangers along the way to the Zhuji phase, she couldn't help but be shocked at this moment. She pressed her hand to her chest, shook her head, and smiled. Ziyuan, you were so dangerous. You really scared us to death. Just now, when I saw that the time was about 14 minutes and 50 seconds, I was in despair. Ruan Hongling also hugged Ziyuan tightly and said with tears and laughter, Shiji Ziyuan, you scared me to death just now. I thought you wouldn't come back. If you're not here, what's the point of me living? Ziyuan smiled softly. She gently stroked Ruan Hongling's back and said softly, don't be silly. I'm back now, aren't I? Zhou Qin saw that although Ziyuan had woken up, Li Yundong was still sitting cross-legged on the spot, motionless. She couldn't help but ask doubtfully, Ziyuan, where's my master? How is he? Ziyuan looked at Li Yundong with a complicated expression and said, he will wake up in a while. Su Chan looked at Ziyuan nervously. Is Yundong all right? Ziyuan also looked at Su Chan and sighed in her heart. You don't know that Li Yundong almost couldn't come back because of you. But in the end, Ziyuan didn't say this out loud. She smiled slightly and comforted her, he's fine. Not only is he fine, but he has also comprehended the great Buddhist Dharma. He is now a complete master of both Buddhist and Taoist cultivation. He has the bearing and posture of a great cultivator. He can't be compared to before. Su Chan blinked her eyes in confusion. How can one comprehend the great Buddhist Dharma after subduing the burning thumb pot? As soon as she finished speaking, she suddenly saw Ling Yu pointing at Li Yundong and exclaiming, look, look. Everyone looked at Li Yundong and couldn't help but be stunned. They saw that the 3 golden needles on Li Yundong's body were constantly trembling and being pushed out little by an invisible force. Finally, this force pushed the golden needles out of Li Yundong's body and gently fell to the ground with a ding. Soon, the burning thumb pot in Li Yundong's hands jumped up into the air, and its whole body bloomed with colorful light. The crystal clear glass burning thumb pot became colorful, as if countless ribbons were surrounding it. On each ribbon, there were countless Vajras practicing magic and countless Arhats chanting sutras. These ribbons quickly drilled into Li Yundong's body, and then the Baihui acupoint on the top of his head suddenly opened. White steam rose from the top of his head, echoing the colorful ribbons released by the burning thumb pot and entwining tightly. Everyone else in the room was dumbfounded. All of them held their breaths and didn't even dare to breathe loudly. These lights entangled together like countless tree vines, quickly forming Vajras in different postures. Then, these Vajras quickly rushed into Li Yundong's body. Every time a Vajra rushed into his body, the light outside quickly formed another Vajra. This repeated. After Su Chan and the others silently counted for a while, they found that there were a total of 18 Vajras. Soon, the light formed another 108 Arhats and rushed into Li Yundong's body. When the 108 Arhats all rushed in, the lingering light finally gathered into a ball and quickly drilled into the space between Li Yundong's eyebrows. As soon as it drilled in, a twisting colorful light gathered between Li Yundong's eyebrows. The colorful light gathered together and kept squirming, twisting, and slowly turning into a vertical pupil. Before Li Yundong opened his eyes, the vertical pupil slowly opened by itself, emitting an awe-inspiring white divine light. Wherever it looked, the pressure was so heavy that it made people's hearts beat faster and they felt a sense of worship. Su Chan, Zhou Qin, and the little foxes were dumbfounded. Ruan Hongling was also dumbfounded. Only Ziyuan was slightly surprised and whispered, sure enough. Su Chan's ears were sharp, and she immediately asked in a low voice, Sister Ziyuan, what did you say? Ziyuan looked at Li Yundong and said with awe, previously, in the spirit space of the burning thumb pot, the divine senses left by the eminent monks of past generations said that Li Yundong is the reincarnation of the immovable wisdom king. Now it seems that it's true. Zhou Qin looked at Li Yundong in shock. She thought to herself, Master Erdini said that I'm the reincarnation of the auspicious goddess, but Li Yundong is the reincarnation of the immovable wisdom king. If he and I are both reincarnations of gods, Will there be others who are reincarnations of gods? Why are there so many reincarnations of gods? Is it to deal with the legendary catastrophe? At this time, Su Chan also exclaimed in a low voice, no wonder when he was visualizing in the past, the god he visualized turned out to be the immovable wisdom king of Buddhism. I was wondering how the Taoist magic he practiced could possibly visualize the god of Buddhism. It turns out that he is the reincarnation of the immovable wisdom king. The little foxes were also amazed and whispered to each other, it turns out that our leader is the reincarnation of the immovable wisdom king? That's amazing. We have such a strong leader. Let's see who dares to bully us now. Our leader is the reincarnation of the immovable wisdom king. That's right. The immovable wisdom king is the king of all wisdom kings and the head of the 5 great wisdom kings. He can subdue all demons. Except for Buddha, he is the most powerful one in the world. The little foxes were talking excitedly in low voices, but suddenly, Ling Yu stretched out her head and said, but aren't we fox spirits? Could it be that our leader, the immovable wisdom king, has subdued us in the end? These words made the little foxes shrink their heads one by one and look at Li Yundong with fear in their eyes. Su Chan's heart couldn't help but skip a beat. She thought to herself, yes, if Li Yundong is really the reincarnation of the immovable wisdom king, I'm a fox spirit. Humans and demons are already at odds with each other, but Buddhas and demons are irreconcilable enemies. What should I do in the future? Yundong must already know that I'm the reincarnation of the immovable wisdom king. Will he despise me, a demon? As the little girl thought about it, she couldn't help but feel sad in her heart. Her eyes turned red and she couldn't help crying. She couldn't wait to throw herself into Li Yundong's arms and ask him what was going on. Just as the little girl was letting her imagination run wild, the vertical pupil on Li Yundong's forehead finally closed slowly, and then the dazzling brilliance slowly stretched into a straight line and disappeared in an instant. When the vertical pupil disappeared, the burning thumb pot in Li Yundong's hand also slowly fell. As soon as it fell into Li Yundong's palm, his body trembled slightly. He hissed and took a deep breath. Everyone felt as if a divine dragon had sucked all the air in the room, and everything around him seemed to be sucked away by Li Yundong. Then, after Li Yundong finished inhaling, he let out a long breath. At this moment, everyone suddenly felt that there was a strong wind in the room, as if they were going to be blown away in the next second. Zhou Qin stared at Li Yundong with her eyes wide open. She had thought that the speed at which she had reached the Zhuji phase was already extremely amazing. At that time, Li Yundong had taken almost twice as long as her, so she should be able to catch up with him. But now it seemed that Li Yundong had reached a realm that she couldn't even reach. She didn't even know how high this realm was. After Li Yundong took a deep breath, he slowly opened his eyes. At this moment, everyone felt that Li Yundong's eyes were like the deep sea, vast and bottomless. If they looked at it for too long, they would be sucked in by his eyes. After Li Yundong opened his eyes, he looked at the crowd, smiled slightly, and said, "How long have I been in meditation?" At this time, none of the women in the room dared to speak. Only Zhou Qin boldly said, "Master, you have been in meditation for 18 days. Li Yundong glanced at Zhou Qin with admiration in his eyes. "You have succeeded in the Zhuji phase. You have also subdued the powerful magical weapon. Congratulations, welcome to the world of cultivators." Li Yundong saw that Zhou Qin was covered in dust. It was obvious that she had been guarding him nervously since she came back. She didn't even have time to take a bath. He smiled and said, "Hurry up and take a bath. Don't stay here." "I'm fine." Only then did Zhou Qin blush. She felt that if she stayed for another second, Li Yundong would dislike her for being sloppy. She quickly turned around and ran out of the room. Li Yundong's gaze shifted to Wan Hongling again. He nodded to her and said with a smile, "Hongling, thank you for escorting Zhou Qin all the way. I will remember your kindness. I will definitely return it in the future." Ruan Hongling put her hands on her hips and said angrily, I don't need you to return the favor. I'm happy to help. It's none of your business. If you really want to return the favor, then pay me more for my labor. I've been rushing all the way here, and my clothes are all dirty. After saying that, she sniffed herself, frowned, and said angrily, there's even a smell. Li Yundong laughed and said, that's still better than the smell of a stinky man. Ruan Hongling made a face at Li Yundong. You're good at talking. I'm going to take a bath. Li Yundong watched Ruan Hongling leave with a smile, and then his eyes fell on Ziyuan. He said with a smile, Ziyuan, you are the one I should thank the most. Ziyuan was looking at the boy who had been reborn in front of her with a complicated gaze. Although she felt that his appearance had not changed, there was something in his bones that had changed dramatically. It seemed that a guru of a generation had already begun to show signs of being a guru. When Ziyuan heard Li Yundong say this to her, she didn't know why, but her cheeks suddenly turned red and she said in a panic, you should thank Su Chan. For you, she chanted Buddhist scriptures day and night, begging Buddha to bless you. She didn't stop for 18 days. You should thank her. After that, Ziyuan turned her head and fled the room in a panic. Li Yundong looked at Ziyuan's departing figure with a little confusion. He shook his head and then looked at Su Chan again. As soon as he saw Su Chan looking at him eagerly, Li Yundong's eyes suddenly became extremely gentle. At this time, Su Chan saw Li Yundong looking at her. She couldn't help but think nervously, Yundong is looking at me. He is the reincarnation of the immovable wisdom king, and I am a fox spirit. Buddhism and demons can't coexist. Will he dislike me? Would he subdue a demon like me, a vixen? Chapter 471. Go to Watch Network. Li Yundong looked at the little girl looking at him with a pitiful look in her eyes. She stood where she was, not daring to go forward. If it had been any other time, she would have cried out and thrown herself into his arms when there was no one around. 7 K.O.M. Li Yundong asked curiously, Chaner, what's wrong? When Su Chan heard Li Yundong call her so intimately, her body couldn't help but tremble slightly, and there was a trace of eagerness in her eyes. She took 2 steps forward, but when she was only a hand away from Li Yundong, she couldn't help but stop. She looked at Li Yundong hesitantly and said softly, Are you the immovable wisdom king or my Yundong? Only then did Li Yundong understand the worries and concerns in the little girl's heart. He couldn't help but feel his heart soften. He stretched out his arm and held the little girl's soft waist in his arms. Li Yundong intimately pinched the little girl's nose and said softly, Silly, what are you thinking about? The little girl greedily sniffed Li Yundong's familiar masculine scent. She felt slightly relieved and thought to herself, my Yundong is still so intimate with me. Am I overthinking it? Su Chan pouted and made a face at Li Yundong. She said with a wronged expression, Don't you know that Buddha and demons can't coexist? You're the reincarnation of the immovable wisdom king. What if one day you reform a little demon like me? Li Yundong laughed, kissed the girl's face, and said affectionately, You little fool, I didn't know in my previous life, but I know one thing in this life. I am an ordinary person, and you are a little demon. I, an ordinary person, like you, a little demon. Do you like me? Su Chan raised her head and rolled her eyes. Suddenly, she smiled mischievously and said, It sounds nice, but I have to hear your true feelings. As she said this, the little girl pressed her face against Li Yundong's chest and said coyly, Tell me. If you lie, I can tell. Li Yundong chuckled. He lowered his head gently and looked at the little girl in front of him with infatuation. He said softly, Little girl, do you know what I've been doing in the 3,000 small worlds of the burning thumb pot these days? Su Chan tilted her head and blinked. What did you do? He caressed the little girl's cheek and said softly, I went from one spirit space to another to find my true self, but no matter which spirit space I was in, I found that you and I could live happily together. In the end, I chose a world where there was no one except for the grandpa and the chick. Then, I quietly watched the two of them live a happy life. Year after year, day after day, the old man and the little girl didn't feel tired at all, and I didn't feel monotonous at all. On the contrary, when I saw them so happy, I thought of the hard times we had gone through together, and my heart was filled with sweetness and happiness. As he said this, Li Yundong held Su Chan's soft hand in his palm and said with a smile, "Even if all the gods and Buddhas oppose me, I won't leave you. You little devil, will you leave me?" Su Chan was very moved when she heard this, and her eyes were sparkling. She looked at Li Yundong with tears in her eyes and suddenly smiled, but tears rolled down her cheeks. She said in a daze, "I won't leave you, unless you dislike me one day and don't want me anymore. Even if you want to purify your little lass someday, little lass will willingly let you do it." Li Yundong laughed and held the little girl tightly in his arms. As if coaxing a child, he said, "Silly, do I need to wait for a day to purify you? I'm going to purify you right now." After that, he bared his fangs and brandished his claws at Su Chan's chest. Su Chan laughed and covered her chest tightly with both hands. She giggled and said, "You're so annoying. You were so solemn just now, but now you've become so obscene. You're so annoying." With a straight face, Li Yundong said in a serious and righteous manner, "Nonsense, I'm still as dignified as before. This is a major event in the world for the sake of carrying on the family line. How can I be obscene and upper class? Don't tell me that all the upper class people in this world don't do such despicable things." Su Chan covered her chest with one hand, and the slender fingers of the other reached out to scratch Li Yundong's face. She giggled and said, "You're so thick-skinned. Aren't you ashamed?" Li Yundong smiled and suddenly opened his mouth. He put the little girl's slender fingers into his mouth like a bird, and then gently pecked the tip of the little girl's fingers with the tip of his tongue. The trace of warmth made the little girl tremble all over. She exclaimed and subconsciously wanted to retract her hand, but as soon as her hand moved, she held back, as if she couldn't bear to pull it back. Su Chan's cheeks were red, and her pretty face was buried in Li Yundong's arms. It seemed that she was shy and wanted to hide from something, but she turned her face sideways and opened one eye wide. She quietly looked at Li Yundong's face through a gap, and the corners of her eyes were full of seductive charm and shyness. Li Yundong was aroused by the little girl's natural charm. His lower body was as hard as a diamond, and he pressed it against the little girl. Su Chan let out a cry and quickly realized what it was. Her whole body became hot and soft, as if she was about to turn into a pool of spring water and melt into Li Yundong's arms. Her small cherry mouth was slightly open, facing Li Yundong's small tent. She stared at the male object and thought in her heart, "Yundong has been with me for so long, but he has never tasted real happiness. Is it too unfair for him?" Thinking of her shyness, the little girl's body became hotter and hotter, and the roots of her ears seemed to be dripping blood. No matter if you are a peerless celestial fox or a peerless demoness, you can't take away my Yuanyang body, let alone destroy my true god Dharmakaya. Think about it, there is a kung fu called the Vajra indestructible body, which is equivalent to the Taoist Jinshin phase. Su Chan's eyes lit up. She suddenly raised her head and said happily, "Yes, the seventh heaven of cultivators is the Jinshin phase. The highest realm of the Jinshin phase is the invincible, immortal, and indestructible. When you reach this realm, then..." Li Yundong laughed, pointed at Su Chan, and deliberately teased her, "Look at you. When it comes to this matter, you get excited. You become smart. You little devil, what's in your head?" Su Chan was very shy and twisted in Li Yundong's arms. She said angrily, "You're so annoying. You're the most anxious about this kind of thing. I just..." As the little girl spoke, she saw Li Yundong looking at her with a smile. His clear and penetrating eyes seemed to see through all her thoughts. Suddenly, she couldn't continue her words. Su Chan blushed and simply let go of her face. She said with a blushing face, "Well, I just want to, so what? Is it wrong to want to have fun with my master?" Li Yundong laughed and said, "Silly girl, when I reach the Jinshan phase, even if my primordial essence leaks out, it won't break my Yuanyang body. At that time, not only can you obtain my Yuanyang Jinshi, but you can also have real dual cultivation with me." Su Chan was fascinated by his words. For a moment, she couldn't help opening and closing her nose. Her eyes were like silk, and her whole body seemed to be on fire. She couldn't wait to immediately fly with her master. Seeing this, Li Yundong stretched out his hand and slapped the little girl's round and fleshy buttocks. He said with a smile, "Well, get up quickly. The people outside are going to laugh at us." Su Chan jumped up with a cry, covering her buttocks. When she got up, she couldn't help turning her head and suddenly asked with a worried expression, "But when can you cultivate to the Jinshan phase? I heard that if the cultivators in the world want to rely on the power of their own Niden to cultivate to the realm of the immortal golden body, it is impossible. They must take the Dun Jin Dan, otherwise they can't cultivate to the realm of the immortal golden body." Li Yundong said with a smile, "Of course I know this, but I've discussed it with Zi Yuan before. The betrothal gift of the Taoist assembly is very likely to be a peerless powerful magical weapon like the Medicine King tripod. If it's such a powerful magical weapon, then I will risk my life to snatch the Medicine King tripod. When the time comes, we will refine elixirs and eat them. We will refine a furnace of Renyuan Jin Dan and give one to everyone. We will refine 30 Dun Jin Dan and each person will eat one and throw one away. Ha ha ha." Su Chan couldn't help but giggle and say, "Do you think these 3 elixirs are Lu Wei Dihuang pills?" Li Yundong also laughed. He held Su Chan in his arms and said, "Well, you have to believe in me. I am the reincarnation of the immovable wisdom king. The Jinshan phase is a piece of cake for him." Su Chan nodded her head vigorously and answered obediently, "Yes. My master is very powerful. In the future, you must protect your girl." Li Yundong laughed and rubbed the girl's hair with one hand. "You used to protect me, but now it's my turn to protect you. Don't worry, there will be no problem. If someone bullies you in the future, no matter if he is Buddha or Guanyin Bodhisattva, I will help you beat him up." The two of them looked at each other and giggled for a while, then went out hand in hand. Li Yundong went out the door and saw that Zi Yuan, Zhou Qin, Wan Hongling, and the little foxes were already in the living room. When they saw him coming out, they all stood up and looked at him in unison. Zhou Qin asked excitedly, "Master, can we go to the Taoist assembly?" Li Yundong smiled and waved his hand. "Of course, let's go." Vote for recommendation. Previous page. Return to table of contents. Next page. Error report. If you like, please click here to add Keeping a Fox at Home to your bookshelf, so that you can read the latest chapters and updates of Keeping a Fox at Home in the future. If you have any suggestions or comments on Keeping a Fox at Home, please click here to express your personal views. Chapter 472. Go to Watch Net. On the 8th day of the 12th lunar month, Dongwu City. Go to Watch Net. The 3 foreigners, Chris, John, and Alba, followed Li Yunyang's footsteps all the way to Dongwu City. They knew that the Taoist assembly would not begin until the next day, so they first found a hotel to stay in and had a good night's sleep. On the 8th day of the 12th lunar month, the 3 of them left early, walked along the ancient canal of Dongwu City, and walked to the Zenshikyo Pier. Along the way, the 3 of them kept taking pictures with their cameras and mobile phones in their hands, marveling at the beautiful scenery of this ancient city that had existed for thousands of years. While taking pictures with her mobile phone, Alba sighed sincerely, "It's so beautiful. This city is really great. I didn't expect that there would be such a beautiful city in China." John also nodded and praised, "I've been to Tiannan City before. In my impression, Tiannan City is a developed modern city. The process of urbanization is very fast, but it feels no different from the cities in our country. As long as the people inside are Americans, you can't tell whether it's a city in China or an American city. But Dongwu City is different. This city has a strong Oriental flavor, which makes me feel like I've returned to ancient China. Since Chris had been teased by her grandmother when she returned to the United States last time, she had put in a lot of hard work and began to study all aspects of China's culture, history, and customs. She smiled slightly and acted as a temporary tour guide. She said with a smile, Dongwu City is full of treasures and has an outstanding people. Since 514 AD, King Fuchai of Wu has built this city here. Since then, this city has been a famous cultural, economic, and political city of this country. 3 foreigners with deep eyes and high noses walked slowly along the willow embankment of the moat of Dongwu City. John and Alba listened carefully as Chris introduced this famous historical city in China. Chris had an outstanding appearance and a tall figure. She walked along the embankment and talked with assurance, attracting the attention of many people. She said in a clear voice, Dongwu City has been very prosperous and developed since ancient times, so it is known as a paradise on earth. Also, because Dongwu City has always been famous for its beautiful scenery and elegant gardens, it has the reputation of being the best garden in the world and the best garden in Dongwu City. Chris pointed to the bridge that spanned the moat, as well as the arch bridges that could be seen everywhere on the side of the road, and said, in the 13th century, Marco Polo came here. Because he saw the small bridges and flowing water here, he praised Dongwu City as the Venice of the East in his travels. Alba smiled and exclaimed, I've been to Venice. It's also a very beautiful city. The style there is completely different from here, but it's hard to tell which one is better. The 3 of them chatted and laughed as they walked along the moat for a while. After walking for about 2 kilometers, they finally arrived near the pier of Xinshe Bridge. As soon as they arrived, the 3 of them saw that the pier was surrounded by all kinds of luxury clubs and entertainment venues. It didn't look like a place where cultivators would hold a party at all. Alba looked around and couldn't help but ask curiously, is the so-called Taoist assembly being held here? Is it being held in a dance bar? Hardadef also looked left and right in confusion. He couldn't help but ask curiously, didn't that man say it was on an oil tanker last time? How can there be a luxury cruise ship here? Chris couldn't help but smile bitterly. Hardadef, don't joke around. Look carefully. This is a moat. Where can a luxury cruise ship come from? Do you think an oil tanker like the Titanic can enter this kind of moat? Oh please, the Titanic can block this river. Hardadef glanced around and suddenly saw a medium-sized cruise ship moored near the pier of Xinshe Bridge. The cruise ship was divided into 2 floors. There was a large balcony on the upper floor, which was obviously for tourists to enjoy the scenery by the river. Below it was a closed cabin that could accommodate about 300 or 400 people. Hardadef pointed at the oil tanker and asked curiously, hey, is this the one? Chris and Alba looked at it together and nodded in unison. It's possible. Let's go and ask. The 3 of them quickly stepped forward. Just as they were about to pass through the pier, they suddenly saw 2 people dressed like tourists approach them. One was fat and the other was thin. The 2 of them glanced up and down at them, then blocked their way. Seeing this, Chris immediately said in fluent Chinese, hello. May I ask if the Taoist assembly is being held here? The 2 of them were stunned. They looked at each other and asked in surprise at the same time, who are you? How do you know about the Taoist assembly? Hardadef quickly leaned over and said cheekily, we are. Chris was afraid that he would act first and report later, so she quickly stamped on his foot with the heel of her high heels. Hardadef felt the pain, and his facial features twisted together. Chris pulled Hardadef, who wanted to cry but had no tears, behind her and said with a smile, I'm Chris, an intern reporter from the Philadelphia Daily, and these 2 are my colleagues. We heard that today is the day of the ancient Taoist assembly of China, so we wanted to interview you. I wonder. Before she could finish her words, the 2 of them said impatiently, what Taoist assembly? I don't know, I don't know. Let's go. This place is closed today. Didn't you see the sign? As he spoke, he pointed to the closed sign hanging at the ticket office next to him. Chris was stunned and was about to say something, but the two of them waved their arms and drove them out. Just then, a luxurious Mercedes-Benz limousine stopped beside the road at the pier, and a few men and women in suits and leather shoes got out of the car. As soon as the two of them saw these people, they were immediately stunned. They went up to them with smiles on their faces, cupped their hands, and said, "May I ask which sect you are from?" The leader was a man with a square face and sword-like eyebrows. He cupped his hands and said, "I'm Du Fei from the Chuanjian Dragon sect." The two people who were welcoming the guests smiled and cupped their hands. It turns out to be Jinren Du, the jade-faced golden monkey. "It's an honor to meet you." Du Fei then introduced a short man next to him and said, "This is my youngest shitty, Yu Sheng, who is known as the Three-Eyed Erlang." The fatter of the two exclaimed and said with a solemn face, "It turns out that Jinren Three-Eyed has arrived. Sorry for my disrespect." Yu Sheng was not tall, but he was extremely arrogant. He looked at the two of them proudly, snorted, and then turned his nostrils to the sky, no longer looking at them. The two of them seemed to know Yu Sheng's temper, so they didn't care about it and just smiled. Du Fei then introduced a woman in a professional suit beside him. He smiled and said, "This is my shimmy, Wei Qing." Wei Qing had light makeup on her face. She smiled sweetly and said, "I'm not a famous cultivator. I'm just here to join in the fun with Shixiang. I don't have a nickname. You can just call me Wei Qing." The two of them saw that Wei Qing was young and beautiful, had a pleasant smile, and was approachable. She was not as arrogant as Yu Sheng. They both laughed and said, "Well said, well said." Wei Qing approached the two of them and asked curiously, "Hey, are all the other sects here?" The thinner of the two said with a smile, "The Yinyang sect of Mount Wuhua has arrived, and so has the Qingwei sect. There are also people from the Donghua sect, the Donghai sect, the Penglai sect, the Jinshan sect, the Loguan Taoist sect, the Qingshui sect, and other sections." Hearing this, Yu Sheng snorted coldly and sneered in a low voice, "They're all a group of nobodies." The two of them glanced at Yu Sheng and felt angry in their hearts. It turns out that only the Chuanjian Dragon sect is a big sect in the world, and only you, Yu Sheng, are famous cultivators. Are the others not worth mentioning? Wei Qing, who was standing to one side, saw that the atmosphere was awkward. She rolled her eyes and quickly tried to smooth things over. She said with a smile, "Oh, there are so many people here. It's so lively. I thought we arrived early. I wonder if Jinrenli has arrived." The two people in charge of welcoming the guests looked at each other in confusion. Jinrenli? Which Jinrenli? Which sect is he from? At this time, Yu Sheng couldn't help snorting coldly again. Who in the world is surnamed Li worthy of being called Jinrenli? The two people in charge of welcoming the guests were both inner disciples of the Gazao sect of external alchemy. Their strength was extraordinary, so they had been sent to welcome the guests. Otherwise, if the cultivators of other sects saw them, they would think to themselves, "It turns out that the cultivators of the Gazao sect are so weak." However, the two of them had not expected that even with their cultivation quotients, not only were they not qualified in Yu Sheng's eyes, but also all the cultivators surnamed Li in the world. His arrogance was boundless. The most annoying thing was that both of them had the surname Li. This sentence was like a slap to the faces of both of them. The fatter one suppressed his anger and said, "I haven't asked Jinren Yu yet. Who in the world is surnamed Li worthy of being called Jinren Li?" Wei Qing saw that the two of them looked unfriendly and were about to lose their temper. She quickly said with a smile, "Oh, of course it's Li Yundong. It's my fault for not asking clearly. It's Li Yundong." When the two people of the Gazao sect of external alchemy heard this, their expressions immediately changed. The fatter one asked seriously, "Is it Li Yundong, the one who took over as the leader of the Fox Zen school from Mount Tianlong?" The thinner one asked, is it Li Yundong who made a scene on Mount Gazao of our ancestral court? When Wei Qing heard this, she complained in her heart, oh no, how could I forget that Li Yundong has a grudge against the Gazao sect? You're really touching on my sore spot. Wei Qing laughed dryly and said, it seems to be this Li Yundong. Ah, haha. The two of them snorted coldly. The fatter one sneered and said, it turns out to be Jinren Li. I was wondering who it was that caught Jinren Yu's attention. I heard that Jinren Yu and Jinren Li seemed to have had a fight last time and suffered a small loss, right? No wonder he can't forget Jinren Li. The thinner one also sneered and said, it's fine if he doesn't come. If he does, we have to let him have a good taste of the power of our external alchemy. Otherwise, will he really think that there is no one in our Gazao sect? Yusheng glanced at the two of them and sneered secretly. Just as he was about to speak, he suddenly heard a clear voice coming from afar. It had a strong Sichuan accent and was laughing. Who is so bold as to look down on the Gazao sect of external alchemy? Don't you know that a strong dragon cannot suppress a local snake? They looked in the direction of the voice and saw 3 young men in Taoist robes walking over slowly. The young man in the lead was tall, handsome, and had an extraordinary temperament. He carried a long sword wrapped in gray cloth on his back, looking inconspicuous. The fatter one cupped one hand in the other before his chest and asked, may I ask who you are? The young man in the lead made a palm with one hand, bowed, and said with a smile, I'm Zhang Cuni from the Qingyang Palace in Chengdu, Sichuan. When everyone heard this, they were shocked. They all looked at Zhang Cuni and thought, is this the future leader of the Qinqing sect, Zhang Cuni, who had said that he would win first place before the Taoist assembly? They looked Zhang Cuni up and down, only to see that he was full of spirit and his eyes were bright. He stood where he was and was really tall. He did have the demeanor of a master of a famous sect and could be called a first-class master of the younger generation in the cultivation world. However, there were many sects and masters in the Taoist assembly. Zhang Cuni dared to boast that he would win first place. There was no doubt that he relied on the powerful magical weapon of the Qinqing sect, the Sanhuang sword. Everyone's eyes finally fell on the inconspicuous 3-feet-long sword wrapped in gray cloth on Zhang Cuni's back. They thought to themselves, is this the famous Sanhuang sword, known as the top magical weapon in the world? See. Chapter 473. Go to watch net. The 2 ushers of the Gazao sect looked at the Sanhuang sword behind Zhang Cuni, smiled at the same time, cupped their hands, and said, it turns out that you are from the Qinqing sect. Please come in, please come in. Zhang Cuni also cupped his hands and smiled. He looked at Du Fei and the others and asked curiously, this is? Without waiting for an introduction, Du Fei smiled and saluted with one hand, Chuanjin Dragon Sect, Du Fei. Wei Qing also smiled and bowed. I'm Wei Qing. Zhang Cuni smiled and returned the salute. His eyes finally fell on Yusheng. When his eyes met Yusheng's, his body immediately shook slightly. He frowned subconsciously, narrowed his eyes, and said, then this must be the 3-eyed Jinren, Yusheng. Yusheng snorted, put his hands behind his back, and said lightly, yes. Zhang Cuni saw that Yusheng was arrogant. He was also a proud person. How could he see anyone more arrogant than him? He snorted and said, I heard that Jinren Yu fought with Jinren Li before and almost harmed mortals. I just don't know who won and who lost. Yusheng frowned and looked at Wei Qing with displeasure. It seemed that he was very dissatisfied that Wei Qing had spread the news about this matter to the entire cultivation world. Watch net. 7 KOM. When Wei Qing saw Yusheng glaring at her, she stuck out her tongue guiltily. Just as she was about to say a few words for Yusheng, she heard Zhang Cuni laugh and say, in fact, it doesn't matter who wins or loses. The important thing is not to be discovered by the secular mortals. Otherwise, wouldn't we cultivators have wasted our time in cultivating our magical powers? As he said this, Zhang Cuni smiled at Du Fei and said, Jinren Du, you are the eldest senior brother. You should supervise your junior brothers in their practice. Otherwise, if their kung fu is not good enough, they will harm others and themselves. This sentence made the people of the Chuanjian Dragon sect so angry that they almost lost their temper on the spot. Yu Xing even opened his eyes wide and stared at Zhang Cuni, clenching his fists tightly. When the fat usher of the Gazao sect saw this, he immediately tried to smooth things over and said, "Oh, we are all fellow Taoists. If there are any grievances, let's talk about it on the boat. How can we get angry here? Jinren Du, Jinren Zhang, Jinren Yu, please come in." The thinner one also advised, That's right. 2,000 years ago, we were all from the same source. Why do we have to argue? Yu Sheng was young and aggressive. He sneered and said, Who has the same origin as them? Are you even worthy? Zhang Cuni sneered, Yes, of course you don't deserve it. Yu Sheng's eyes widened and he was about to lose his temper. Wei Qing, who was standing to one side, had sharp eyes and saw several people in Taoist robes walking over from a distance. She quickly changed the topic and said, Hey, look, another fellow Taoist is coming. Hey, why are they wearing Taoist robes? Du Fei, who was standing to one side, couldn't help but say curiously, Yes, it's been many years since I've seen someone wearing Taoist robes attend the Taoist assembly. The Taoist assembly had been held for more than 1,300 years since the time of Emperor Xuanzong of Tang. In the beginning, the Taoist assembly was a grand gathering of Taoist cultivators in the world. Those who were not from the Taoist sects could not participate, so naturally, all the participants were Taoists wearing Taoist robes. However, with the changes of the times, in order to adapt to the development of the dynasty, the Taoist sects resumed the Taoist assembly. In order to avoid the eyes and ears of the world, and even more so to avoid the taboo of the current government, many cultivators changed to ordinary people's casual clothes. Gradually, this formed a tacit rule of the Taoist assembly. But today, more than a dozen Taoist cultivators in Taoist robes had suddenly come all the way. How could they not be surprised? Even Zhang Cuni and Yu Sheng, who had been angry at the beginning, couldn't help but be stunned and wonder in their hearts. But when these people got closer, they found that the person in the lead had a dignified appearance with a cinnabar mole between her eyebrows. It was Zhang Ling, the elder sister of Taoist Zhang, the leader of the Zhengyi school. Only then did they know that this group of people in Taoist robes were actually fellow Taoists of the Zhengyi school. Although the Gazao sect and the Zhengyi school had done a lot of dirty things in private, they were still very dignified on the surface. The two Taoists in charge of welcoming the guests immediately went up to greet them. The fatter one saluted with one hand and said, It turns out that the fellow members of the Zhengyi school have come. Please come in. Zhang Ling was followed by more than a dozen people, and the one who followed her the closest was her disciple, Zhou Ping. Next to Zhou Ping stood the dignified Wang Lingfei and a well-behaved little girl, who was also wearing a Taoist robe. It was the little shimmy who had been monitoring Li Yunyang's family with her before. Zhang Ling didn't even look at the two of them, nor did she look at the people of the Chuanjian Dragon sect and the Qingqing sect. She raised her head and walked inside. Since they took the lead, the others naturally followed suit. Only the little shimmy looked at Du Fei, Yu Sheng, Zhang Cuni, and the others curiously. Then she stuck out her tongue and quickly followed them. The behavior of the people of the Zhengyi school made the people who had wanted to be polite to the people of the Zhengyi school feel embarrassed. The people of the Gazao sect were angry in their hearts. Good heavens, I thought Yu Sheng was arrogant enough, but I didn't expect that Zhang Cuni from Qingdu, Sichuan, would be even more arrogant than Yu Sheng. Now, it turns out that the most arrogant one is yet to come. The Zhengyi school simply ignores everyone. Are they so arrogant just because their sect is powerful? Yu Sheng and Zhang Cuni also stared at the Taoist priests of the Zhengyi school with twinkling eyes. Just as they were about to sneer and ridicule them, another Taoist priest in a Taoist robe suddenly followed them. Although he was in a hurry, this Taoist priest had delicate features, a handsome face, and eyes like stars. At first glance, they could tell that he was a great young master. They took a closer look and saw that the Taoist priest was wearing a Taoist robe with gold rims and a black and white 8 trigrams pattern on his chest. Du Fei took a look and saw that this person was Zhang Tianhe, the Yuyang Zhenren whom he had met once on Mount Tianlong. Zhang Tianhe? Has his injury healed? Du Fei was slightly stunned. He took the initiative to step forward and salute. Zhenren Zhang, how have you been? Zhang Tianhe stopped with a smile and said, it turns out to be Zhenren Du, nice to meet you. Du Fei smiled and said, why is Zhenren Zhang walking at the back? Zhang Tsuni, who was standing to one side, was very unhappy after being treated coldly by Zhang Ling and the others. At this time, he vented all his anger on Zhang Tianhe. He sneered and said, is it because Zhenren Zhang's injury hasn't healed after the battle on Mount Tianlong? The battle on Mount Tianlong had been regarded by Zhang Tianhe as a great shame. When he heard Zhang Tsuni mention it, his face suddenly changed slightly. He saluted with one hand and said, may I ask who this fellow Taoist is? Zhang Tsuni snorted and said, Zhang Tsuni of the Qingyang Palace in Chengdu. Zhang Tianhe smiled slightly and retorted sarcastically, it turns out to be Zhang Tsuni, the fellow Taoist who was sent down the mountain by Li Yundong at the foot of Mount Tianlong. I'm sorry. Zhang Tsuni had fought with Li Yundong in private and suffered a loss. He had always thought that it was a secret and no one knew about it, but he hadn't expected that it would be pointed out by Zhang Tianhe. Zhang Tsuni's face changed and he was shocked. How did he know? Could it be that Li Yundong has spread it everywhere? Humph, it must be so. This despicable man, I must teach him a lesson today. As the saying goes, people strive for dignity, while Buddhas strive for incense. Although cultivators pay attention to pure hearts and few desires and are indifferent to fame and fortune, they regard their reputation as more important than anything else. Moreover, at this time, it was the beginning of the Taoist assembly. If he admitted this matter, wouldn't he be admitting that he was inferior to Li Yundong? How could Zhang Tsuni, who had always thought highly of himself, be willing to do such a thing? Zhang Tsuni sneered and said, there's no such thing. I really don't know what nonsense you're talking about. Yu Sheng, who had been ridiculed by Zhang Tsuni before, also took the opportunity to add insult to injury. He sneered sinisterly, if you don't want people to know, don't do it. What, Zhang Tsuni, haven't you been educated? Oh, I really don't know why your father let you come out at ease. Isn't he afraid that you'll make a fool of yourself? Zhang Tsuni suddenly became furious and glared at Yu Sheng. Yu Sheng did not show any weakness, and his eyes were as sharp as knives. Zhang Tianhe, who was standing to one side, saw the two of them staring at each other like fighting cocks. He laughed and said, brothers of the Tao, please go ahead. I'll leave now. Zhang Tsuni and Yu Sheng immediately turned their heads and said in unison, don't go. Zhang Tianhe turned his head and sneered. What, do you want me to stay? Zhang Tsuni sneered and said, I just want to test your kung fu skills. The Taoist of the Gazao sect, Du Fei, and the others were stunned. The fatter Taoist of the Gazao sect whispered, Shixiang, what should we do? It seems that the situation is getting more and more difficult. The thinner Taoist also whispered, forget it, let's watch them fight. On the other side, Wei Qing of the Chuanzhen Dragon sect saw that the three of them were about to fight, so she tried to persuade them, well, stop talking. The three of you have all suffered at Li Yundong's hands. As the saying goes, every injustice has its perpetrator, and every debt has its debtor. When Li Yundong comes, it won't be too late for you to fight. When Zhang Tsuni, Yu Sheng, and Zhang Tianhe heard this, they were stunned at the same time. They immediately felt the same hatred for the enemy. Zhang Tsuni sneered and said, does Li Yundong dare to come? Yu Sheng also said coldly, if he dares to come, I will definitely make him lose convincingly this time. Zhang Tianhe was silent, and a sharp light suddenly flashed in his eyes. Since he had been defeated by Li Yundong last time, he had gone back to cultivate in seclusion. His cultivation and kung fu were no longer the same as before. He had been waiting for the day to wash away his shame. Chris, John, and Alba, who were watching all this from a distance, also stared at the Taoists in different clothes. Alba couldn't help asking, "Chris, what's going on? Who are these people in robes? Are they monks?" Chris didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Don't joke around. They are Taoist priests, cultivators of Taoism. Buddhism came from India, and Taoism is a native religion of China." Only then did Alba understand. "Oh, I see. But why are some of them dressed like this and others like that?" John shrugged his shoulders and said, "This is a free country. At least, we can wear clothes freely, can't we?" Alba rolled her eyes at him. "Thank you for your explanation. I'm very satisfied with it. So, Mr. Liberal, can you tell me how we can get in and watch this Taoist assembly? Are we going to watch it from the shore later?" John smiled bitterly and said, "We can't watch it from the shore. You know, this cruise ship can move." Alba turned to look at Chris. "Chris, hurry up and think of a way." Chris spread out her hands. "What can I do? We are not Taoist priests." Alba couldn't help shouting, "We came all the way here from the United States. Are we going to be stumped?" While the three foreigners were staring at each other, at their wits' end, Chris suddenly heard a familiar voice. "Yundong, is that the cruise ship? Why is the Taoist assembly being held here? It's so strange." Chris turned her head and saw a beautiful and lovely girl snuggling up to a handsome man, talking with a sweet smile. Although they were far away, Chris still recognized at a glance that the girl with a beautiful voice like a silver bell was Su Chan, and the man next to her was Li Yundong. Even though Chris was from a big family and had an extremely strict upbringing, she couldn't help but pull John's arm excitedly. "John, look, who is this?" At first, John looked over listlessly, but when he saw who it was, his eyes suddenly widened and he jumped up excitedly. He laughed and said, "It's Master, Master is here." Alba was stunned. "Lose? What do you mean lose? Is it Li Yundong you were talking about? Is that B** starred here? Where is he? I want to scold him to death." In the distance, Hardadef shouted excitedly, attracting many passers-by to look at him. Du Fei and the others also looked at them. Du Fei smiled bitterly and couldn't help but glare at his little junior sister. "Speak of the devil, and the devil comes. Wei Qing, you really have a jinx." Wei Qing didn't seem to see Du Fei's gaze. She also saw Li Yundong at a glance and shouted excitedly, "Look, Jinren Li is here." Zhang Cuni, Yu Sheng, and Zhang Tianhe immediately looked at Li Yundong at the same time. It was as if Mars had collided with Earth, and a strong jinqi surged around them. The wind was fierce and murderous, as if they were going to fight in the next second. Vote for recommendation previous page next page error report if you like. Please click here to add Keeping a Vixen at Home to your bookshelf so that you can read the latest chapters and updates in the future. If you have any suggestions or comments on Keeping a Vixen at Home, please click here to express your views. Chapter 474. Go to watch net. Seeing that a big fight was about to break out before the Taoist assembly had even begun, the two Taoist ushers of the Gazao sect were so anxious that they were sweating profusely. They tried to persuade one of them but failed to persuade the other. It was really like holding the gourd down and the ladle up. Watch net. 7 KOM. What's more, Wei Qing, who was eager to see the world in chaos, was fanning the flames from time to time. Especially when she saw Li Yundong, her eyes lit up, and her excited expression seemed to be saying, "Fight, fight, hurry up and fight. Let's see who's more powerful." Du Fei had been cultivating in the secular world for a long time. As the eldest Shixiang of the Chuanjin dragon sect, he was also relatively stable. He thought with a headache, isn't this little sister too strange? Why was he trying to mediate the fight and then causing trouble? The fat Taoist usher of the Gazao sect said with a wry smile, Dear Jinren, today is a big day in our cultivation world, which happens once every 4 years. It's not a big deal to fight here, but it's a big deal to make the government unhappy. Even if we win, we'll be covered in blood. What glory is there to celebrate? The thinner Taoist also hurriedly persuaded, if you have any grudges, can't you solve them at the Taoist assembly later? Zhang Tianhe was the first to withdraw his gaze. He smiled slightly and said, You two are right. We'll see what happens at the Taoist assembly later. After saying that, he walked towards the cruise ship at the dock. Zhang Cuni and Yu Sheng looked at each other and boarded the cruise ship one after another. Only Du Fei and Wei Qing had a good relationship with Li Yundong, so they stayed and watched him approach. Wei Qing watched as Li Yundong approached with a group of little foxes from the Fox Zen school, surrounded by Zi Yuan, Zhou Qin, Su Chan, and the others. She couldn't help but laugh and say, It's said that Jinren Li is a romantic saint. Now it seems that it's true. He really deserves his reputation. But it's no wonder. This Li Jinren is modest, gentle, and humorous. He's also handsome, and his cultivation and kung fu are also very good. No wonder so many people like him. When a woman looks at a man, and when a man looks at a man, the angle is completely different. Du Fei looks at Li Yundong's bearing and spirit. It had been more than a month since they had last parted. Li Yundong's appearance at this time obviously meant that he had subdued the burning thumb pot. Du Fei knew how difficult it was to subdue the burning thumb pot, so he had not used it for a long time. Du Fei looked at Li Yundong carefully and couldn't help but say to Wei Qing, Shimmy, do you think there's anything different about Li Yundong? Wei Qing sized him up and nodded with a smile. Yes. Du Fei couldn't help but smile and nod, yes, I noticed it too. What do you think is different? Wei Qing smiled and said, You've become even more handsome. You've become more mature. Du Fei was so angry that he laughed. Why do you only pay attention to this? Wei Qing looked at him in confusion. Then what should I pay attention to? Du Fei shook his head and helplessly said, Master is kind enough to let you enter the secular world to cultivate and gain experience. But you're reading fashion magazines all day, chasing this star today and that star tomorrow. What's the use of just paying attention to people's appearance? We cultivators cultivate on the inside, not the outside. Wei Qing was not convinced and retorted, I have paid attention to his inner qualities. Du Fei glared at her. Still talking back. You haven't paid attention to anything. Wei Qing glared back without showing any weakness. I feel that he has matured. Isn't maturity coming from the inside? Du Fei was so angry that he laughed. Just as he was about to teach his little Shimmy a lesson, he saw that Li Yundong and the others had already walked over. Li Yundong cupped his hands with a smile and said, Jinren Du, we meet again. Du Fei had no choice but to glare at Wei Qing, indicating that he would let her go for the time being. He turned his face, laughed, and cupped his hands. Jinren Li, I haven't seen you for half a month. Your cultivation has become more and more refined. Just now, when you came from afar, you already had the bearing of a master. Congratulations. Li Yundong smiled modestly and said, Not at all. I have to thank you for your help, Jinren Du. Du Fei laughed and said, Don't mention it. We're all in the same boat. There's no need to be so polite. While Li Yundong and Du Fei were chatting, a shout suddenly came from not far away. A foreign man with a strange accent shouted, Master, Master. Li Yundong was slightly stunned when he heard the voice. He only felt that it was a little familiar, but he couldn't remember who it was for a moment. When he turned his head to look, he was shocked. Li Yundong saw Hardadef, Chris, and a tall foreign girl with a South American style running over. He asked curiously, hard to deaf? Chris? Why are you here? Is there another exchange student in the school this year? Hardadef looked excited. He said loudly in a non-standard Chinese language, Master, you said that if I could speak Chinese, you would accept me as your disciple. Li Yundong smiled bitterly in his heart. Oh no, I just said it casually at that time, but this guy is so stupid that he took it seriously. Li Yundong didn't answer him. He turned to look at Chris and asked, Chris, why are you here? Chris lifted her wavy blonde hair and said with a smile in a standard Chinese language, I'm also here to be your disciple. Li Yundong shook his head and said with a smile, Didn't I tell you last time that my kung fu is only passed on to men and not to women? Chris seemed to have expected that Li Yundong would say this. She pointed at Hardadef and said, Then you should accept him, because you promised him that as long as he could speak Chinese, you would accept him as your disciple. Chinese have a saying that goes, a promise is worth 9 tripods. For your words, we came here from the distant United States. You should keep your promise. Hardadef, who was standing to one side, also puffed out his chest and sucked in his stomach, as if he were a Boy Scout waiting to be inspected by an officer. His face was full of nervousness and excitement. From time to time, he glanced at Li Yundong, and his hands, which were beside his trousers, kept sweating. From time to time, he grabbed his trousers and wiped them. Li Yundong smiled bitterly. He hadn't expected that Chris would actually block his words here, making it impossible for him to refute. He sighed and said, Chris, if you want to learn kung fu, I can teach you. No problem. Hardadef hurriedly shouted, No, master, I want to learn your superhuman kung fu, the kind that can send people flying with one punch and dodge bullets. If I wanted to learn kung fu, I could have learned it in the United States. Why did I come here? Li Yundong shook his head. That won't work, Hardadef. Hardadef was so anxious that he blurted out in English, God, why not? Can't I speak Chinese? Alba, who was standing to one side, had been listening to them speak Chinese and was confused. At this time, she finally heard a sentence that she could understand. She immediately said to Li Yundong, Hey, are you still living in the old era of the last century? Why are you so young and full of old ideas? Please, it's the 21st century now. Look around you. Your compatriots are so open-minded. They are no different from us Americans in many ways. Why are your ideas so old-fashioned? Why can't Hardadef be your disciple? Why can't Chris? Is it just because she's a woman? What's wrong with women? What can't women do? Alba spoke hurriedly and quickly, like a light machine gun, firing off a lot of words. Li Yundong listened with his eyes wide open. After a while, he turned his head to look at Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and Zhou Qin. Did anyone understand what she said? Zhou Qin's English was good, but after all, it was different from Native Americans. Even Americans with slow reactions might not be able to fully understand Alba's fast speech. She smiled bitterly and said, I only understood 2 sentences. Zi Yuan also shook her head and said with a smile, I don't understand either. Su Chan blinked and asked, She's just a barbarian. Why do you care about her? Li Yundong smiled and tapped Su Chan's nose. You're more xenophobic than I am. Chris said, How about I translate it? Before Li Yundong could speak, he saw Wei Qing giggling with her mouth covered. Li Yundong turned around and said to her with a smile, Zhenren Wei, do you understand? Wei Qing quickly waved her hand. I don't deserve to be called a Zhenren. I understand a little. If you don't mind, I'll translate it for you. Li Yundong chuckled. That's good. Hurry up and translate. Wei Qing smiled and translated Alba's words. Li Yundong listened carefully. After he finished, he said to Wei Qing, I have a few words to say. Help me translate. Chris, who was standing to one side, said indignantly, Why can't I translate? Li Yundong smiled slightly and said, Chris, I know you have a good understanding of Chinese culture, but that's only for Americans. You're still far from truly understanding Chinese culture. There are many things that your translation may not be as accurate as Jinren Wei's. Wei Qing made a face at Chris with a smile, and Chris turned her head angrily. Li Yundong said politely to Alba, beautiful American lady, thank you very much for your kind reminder. But if you have read the Tao Te Ching of Lao Zi, the founder of Taoism, you should know this sentence. It goes like this, a fish can't escape from the abyss, and the sharp weapons of a country can't be shown to others. What does this mean? It means that the most important things of a country can never be shown to outsiders. If I wanted to see your country's confidential information, would your people let me see it? Wei Qing looked at Li Yundong with admiration and secretly gave him a thumbs up. She laughed and said in a low voice, good eloquence. Wei Qing smiled and translated Li Yundong's words. Then, she said to John sympathetically, don't think about it. Hurry back to the United States. We welcome your Taoism, but if you want to learn our cultivation skills, that's absolutely impossible. At this time, Li Yundong also laughed and said, it's not impossible. Wei Qing and Du Fei were stunned at the same time. Du Fei blurted out, Jinrenli, you can't do that. In the past 2,000 years, no one in our cultivation world has ever dared to accept a barbarian as a disciple. If you accept them, you will become the target of the cultivation world. Li Yundong smiled and waved his hand, saying disapprovingly, Jinren Du, this is a little inappropriate. In my opinion, Wang Jinyuan, the master of the Gazao sect, is a mixed-race person. The fat Taoist usher of the Gazao sect, who had been silent all this time, said unhappily, Jinrenli, our sect master only looks like him. He is from Xinjiang, so he looks like a foreigner. Li Yundong laughed and said, that's right. The people of Xinjiang are also our children. But have you ever thought about what happened hundreds or even thousands of years ago? Before the Xinjiang people became part of our Chinese territory, were they the so-called barbarians that we speak of? Li Yundong's words stunned everyone, and they all looked thoughtful. Li Yundong continued, moreover, our country has always regarded itself as the Central Kingdom. For thousands of years, countless foreign nationalities, which we call barbarians, invaded the Central Plains. In the end, they were all assimilated and became a part of the Chinese nation. In the end, we all recognize them as part of the Chinese nation. What does this mean? It means one thing. As long as they speak the Chinese language, learn Chinese culture, believe in Chinese beliefs, and have Chinese nationality, they are part of the Chinese people. I can teach them the art of cultivation. Du Fei listened attentively, especially when he heard the words, have Chinese nationality. He couldn't help cheering in his heart and thought to himself, Jinrenli is really cunning. It's too embarrassing to refuse directly, but he actually gave these foreign devils such a difficult problem. Are these foreign devils willing to change their nationality for cultivation? Vote for recommendation. Previous page. Return to the table of contents. Next page. Error report. If you like, please click here to add Raising a Fox at Home to your bookshelf, so that you can read the latest chapters and updates of Raising a Fox at Home in the future. If you have any suggestions or comments on Raising a Fox at Home, please click here to express your views. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.